A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never thought a simple decision about Christmas morning would spiral into something that felt like a living nightmare, but here we are. My husband and I had always imagined our children waking up to a sea of colorful wrapping paper, their laughter and innocence filling the air like the smell of fresh pine from our tree. So, when my husband's parents were insistent about joining us to watch our kids open their gifts, I hesitated, not because I didn't want them there, but because of the dark, quiet secrets that always seemed to surface whenever I spent time with them. See, my in-laws have this unsettling ability to twist every joyful occasion into an underlying tension, an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. The first Christmas we spent together, they arrived early, their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes too focused on my every move as I tried to set the scene of holiday cheer, and I remember my daughter's joyous squeal being overshadowed by a comment from my mother-in-law about how children shouldn't be spoiled with so much. That experience pushed me to set boundaries, and I was firm this year. I want this to be a special moment just for us, I told my husband, who reluctantly agreed, aware of the strange weight our in-laws carried in our lives, almost like a curse that cast shadows over even the happiest days. But then Christmas morning arrived, and my excitement quickly turned into dread when I saw a text from my mother-in-law at 5 a.m., saying she couldn't wait to see them, her unwavering enthusiasm creeping under my skin like ice. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a storm cloud as I sipped my coffee, the aroma mingling with the unmistakable scent of impending chaos. I insisted to my husband that the whole family could come over later, after the presents, but he had that look, one of silent defiance, as if stepping into the battlefield to protect what little peace we had left. As the hour approached for the kids to wake, I went into survival mode, meticulously hand-picking the ornaments our daughter had decorated the night before, but the glee in my heart felt hollow. The little ones bounded in, their eyes sparkling brighter than any Christmas light, and I could almost forget the impending doom at my back, that is, until the doorbell rang just when they were about to dive into the pile of gifts. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. My husband shot me a panicked look, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I could only imagine who stood on the other side. Sure enough, there they were, my in-laws, faces beaming, clutching bags filled with their own presents, as if it were theirs to share. My body reacted instinctively. I stepped in front of the kids as if I could shield them from this intruding wave, all my intentions to keep Christmas pure unraveling before my eyes. We agreed, I stuttered, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough for them to hear. We wanted today just for our family. For a brief moment, there was silence, and I could see my father-in-law's smile falter, flickering like a muted TV screen in a dark room, but then my mother-in-law's expression twisted, and it made me physically recoil. "Sweetheart," she said in that deceptively soft tone that made my skin crawl, "you don't want to spoil the holiday spirit, do you?" My husband stepped up to diffuse the tension, but a knot tightened in the pit of my stomach, and before I knew it, I was leading the children upstairs, almost dragging them from the scene that morphed into an argument between my husband and his parents, a battle of wills that would shatter the already fragile thread of our Christmas. I tucked the kids under my arms like precious jewels, whispering to them that everything would be okay, but their wide eyes mirrored the confusion I felt too. I could almost hear my own heart pounding above the muffled shouts from downstairs, like a metronome marking the passage of time, and despite knowing we were safe up there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was brewing just out of sight. When I heard silence settle like dust in the aftermath of their words, I finally ventured down the hallway, only to witness the scene of my husband sitting on the couch, face pale, looking utterly broken as his parents stood above him, faces still twisted with that disconcerting blend of disappointment and determination to claim their power. "I can't believe you'd deny your children this happiness," my mother-in-law hissed. My mind spiraled, torn between wanting to run back upstairs and wanting to protect my husband from this mental assault, but when I stepped into the room, all eyes turned to me, and I instantly regretted it. "Look what you're doing to him," I shouted before thinking, and my voice echoed like a bell in a deserted abbey, cutting their glares into shards that sliced at the very fabric of our family. My husband's eyes flickered to me with a strange mixture of shame and longing, the pleading look in them begging me to stop, but there was no stopping it now. The moment had escalated into chaos, civil war waged over the rights to Christmas morning, and I felt the darkness closing in around us, a smothering shroud threatening to choke the life out of my children's excitement. I couldn't take it, couldn't breathe in that suffocating atmosphere filled with resentment, and I grabbed my kids, ushering them back upstairs, with a scream trapped in my throat. My heart pounded as our little family barricaded ourselves in, the noise of their increasingly furious voices fading into the background until all I could hear was the sound of my children's confused whispers. I tried to reassure them with soft words, but how could I explain the evils that lurked outside that door? My husband joined us moments later, yet the defeat on his face was a mirror reflecting the horrible reality. This year's Christmas was shattered, our joy stolen, and as he pulled us together, it felt like a fragile house of cards, just waiting for one more gust of wind to take it down. Hours passed, my stomach twisted in knots while the sun crept into the sky, illuminating the shadows of our crumbling home until finally, we heard the door slam. A rush of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when my husband dared to open the door. When he peeked out, I quickly felt something dark brewing in his gaze, the kind that made my heart sink into my stomach. He turned to me, eyes glazed with disbelief, and whispered, "They're gone." The heaviness in the air was almost tangible, and I knew, in that instant, that things would never be the same. We came together, holding our children close, but the feeling of dread never left. How could we ever celebrate Christmas the same? Each year afterwards became a reminder of that singular moment, wrestling against the ropes of doubt and discontent that our own families tied around us, leaving my husband and I in a constant battle to keep our children's innocence untarnished while the darkness of anger and grief loomed just beyond the walls. I realized with a sinking heart that Christmas wasn't merely a day, it became a symbol, a battleground in my mind, a reminder that in-laws could bring a darkness unlike any other, slowly creeping in like a thief of joy, and whether it was worth the cost of keeping them away on that one single day would haunt me for the years to come. Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. "Fine," Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, "but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all." As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. "Good news, huh?" he chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. "I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what." My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. "Walter, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. "Why do you keep coming around?" The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. "Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around." The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. "You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him." My accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind, but by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. "Dad, you need to." Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. "You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here," he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. "Leave him alone," I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. "She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer," he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. "You don't need him, Dad." You have me, we'll do this together, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. "Dad," I began slowly, "we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered." The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. "Don't listen to her, old friend," Walter interjected smoothly, "she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we?" But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. "You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions." The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. "He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you," Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. "Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant?" But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. "You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name?" The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. "Dad, please, you need to believe me," I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, "If you love him, you'll let him go." Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. "You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you." My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. "Enough," Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. "You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been." With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. "Let's leave together," I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. "You can't save him from the truth," Walter whispered, "he will always be with me." "No more," I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. "No, we can build a future together." The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. "It's him, isn't it?" I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. "He's coming back for us." The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. "You're not going back there," I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where I'd have to confront my boyfriend's aunt over a Coachella ticket, but here I am, sitting on this dingy couch, heart racing as the realization of what just transpired washes over me like a tidal wave. It all started innocently enough. My boyfriend, Jake, had promised me a magical weekend filled with music, friends, and memories after saving up for months to attend the festival, and when I casually mentioned that I'd be bringing my best friend Sarah along too, Jake's excitement turned into something else entirely. He had a pretty big family, and while I loved spending time with them, his Aunt Linda was a piece of work, horribly intrusive and always looking for ways to reap the benefits of being part of the family. So when she sidled up to me at dinner last week, flashing her overly bright smile and the glimmer of something sinister in her eyes, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, sweetie, how nice for you to go to Coachella. I'd love to see what all the fuss is about," she cooed, her voice dripped with mock sincerity. I didn't think much of it at first, but that Saturday morning when I reached for my ticket to send to Sarah, my stomach dropped, it was gone. I frantically searched every corner of my room, thinking I'd simply misplaced it, but deep down, I knew. I could feel her eyes watching me during dinner, lingering a little longer when she asked, and I gleefully explained how I'd managed to snag a ticket against the odds. It felt awful admitting it to Jake, but he was just as angry as I was. He assured me we'd confront her together. So, the following Sunday, after pacing back and forth, rehearsing a dozen ways to address the theft, we finally knocked on her door. I never wanted to escalate the situation, but when she opened the door in her threadbare pajamas, looking more disheveled than usual, and when I said, "Aunt Linda, we need to talk about the ticket," her expression shifted from surprise to amusement, and then to smugness, like she held all the cards in this game that I barely understood. "Oh sweetheart, did you really think you'd get away with that? A Coachella ticket? You should have known I'd take it." "It's nothing personal, it's just business," she said matter-of-factly, as if she were discussing the weather. An icy pit formed in my stomach as the earlier thrill of my impending trip dissipated into sheer disbelief. "You can't be serious. You're stealing from your own family." "That's messed up," I managed to choke out, but she waved her hand dismissively, her laughter echoing in that cramped entryway. That's when I snapped, "I could call the cops on you, Linda." "Stealing a ticket is still a crime," I spat, regretting my harsh tone a moment later, but the truth hung in the air, and I could tell it hit her harder than I expected. The lightheartedness faded as something darker tightened around her eyes, and for a brief moment, it felt as if shadows shifted within her soul, revealing fractured intentions. "You really want to take this higher?" she asked, amusement gone, replaced by a low, chill-inducing whisper. My palms became clammy. I hadn't actually wanted to threaten her or anything, but there was something twisted about the way she responded, like she was unbothered and yet simmering beneath the surface. Without waiting for my reply, she slammed the door shut, leaving Jake and me standing there in utter disbelief. The drive home was numbingly silent, but the tension hung between us like a potential storm on the horizon. A week passed and our Coachella dreams began to fade into bitter memories, and that's when I received a text, "I hope you're ready for me to spoil your weekend." I felt a wave of anger mixed with dread as I read the message again. Who the hell did she think she was? Jake urged me to let it go, saying it wasn't worth the trouble, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Aunt Linda was more than just a quirky family member with questionable morals. The night before we were set to leave, I couldn't sleep. The thought of stepping into a festival atmosphere while knowing she might be lurking around transformed my excitement into anxiety. I smashed my phone down when another notification lit up, followed by a loud, menacing snicker cascading from the darkness outside my window. A memory flickered to life, the way that Linda gazed at me, almost as if she enjoyed my discomfort. That very night, Sarah, who had driven in from out of town, texted that she was running late due to roadwork, and in no time, Jake and I were ready to go, practically bouncing off the walls despite the aura of dread contradicting our enthusiasm. The sun beat down mercilessly as we drove to the venue, the vibe electric with anticipation, yet I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Glancing around, jitters coursed through me until we finally parked and made our way through the crowd, the bass vibrating beneath our feet, the air thick with the sweet aroma of festival food and excitement. Music filled the air as we found our place among friends, but as the first band took the stage, I felt someone watching me from the edge of the crowd. My heart raced as I turned. There, mingling with festival goers, was Aunt Linda, looking as innocent as ever, rocking her signature flower crown. Panic clouded my mind. Did she come to ruin my experience, or was it some twisted intervention? I nudged Jake and pointed. "What the hell is she doing here?" He turned sharply. "Give it a rest, she's probably just enjoying herself," but I wasn't convinced. I spent the next few sets watching her from afar, and the longer I stared, the more she appeared to embody this harbinger of chaos, weaving through groups of people and then disappearing into the crowd. It was only during the third set that everything escalated. Sarah and I were dancing, lost in the rhythms, but suddenly I felt a hand grab my shoulder, yanking me back. I spun around, ready for a confrontation, when I came face to face with Linda, her eyes glinting with something dark, her mouth twisted in a strange smile. "You didn't think you'd get here unscathed, did you?" she sneered, her voice a sickly sweet whisper. My stomach dropped as Jake rushed to my side, anger flaring in his chest, but before he could say anything, she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my ear and said, "You should have kept your mouth shut, honey, you have no idea who you're dealing with." This is my playground. Then she slipped into the crowd, leaving us stunned, my heart racing in my chest. I felt sick. Who was this woman that she turned a simple estrangement into something so sinister? I wanted to enjoy this festival more than anything, but the gnawing sense of danger lingered like a shadow, overshadowing even the brightest moments. The night stretched on, and hours passed, filled with intoxicating music and laughter tinged with anxiety until finally, just when I thought I could breathe easy again, I turned and spotted Linda once more, lurking, but this time she was speaking to a group of security guards. Fear coursed through me. There was no doubt in my mind this woman was plotting something malicious. Within moments, murmurs began spreading through the crowd, and then chaos erupted. Someone had punched one of the security guards, and as bodies began to flee, I saw Jake look toward me, panic etched across his face. "We have to go now," he yelled, and we made a run for it along with hundreds of others, the bliss of the festival engulfed by sheer terror. I glanced back and saw Linda, somehow reveling in the pandemonium she'd unleashed, and it hit me, the ticket, the threat, the laughter, they'd all been part of some twisted game she played, and now I was a player in her insane reality. As we slipped past the barriers and swarmed into the parking lot, the echoes of sirens neared with each step. Where did she go? I gasped, searching the crowd, but my entire body screamed that this wasn't over. We piled into the car, and although Jake fumbled with keys, I stared into the chaos we'd just escaped. "Aunt Linda's insane," I breathed. He nodded, eyes fixed on the growing crowd around us. Just when we thought we'd slipped away, my phone buzzed again with a text, "You can't escape me. I'll find you, sweetheart." That night, every ounce of excitement was completely drained from me, and as we sat parked outside our apartment, I realized this Coachella trip had turned into a nightmare filled with threats woven into memories, and Aunt Linda was only the beginning. I never thought I'd say this, but I might actually have to call the cops. I wasn't planning on going to my family's Thanksgiving dinner this year. I had been avoiding my relatives since that summer when my cousin Jake had found the old family recipe book in my grandmother's attic, the one marked with an odd symbol on the cover, like a twisted vine, which he insisted we use for the pumpkin pie, but I shrugged him off, dismissing any thoughts of using something that felt so out of place in a holiday tradition. Still, after weeks of nagging from my mother, I reluctantly agreed to attend, convinced that it would simply be a classic fight over politics and the same old complaints about how I was still single in my mid-20s. Yet, as the last rays of autumn sunlight dipped below the horizon and I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, a strange feeling twisted in my stomach, an instinct warning me that something was lurking just beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family gathering. I walked into the house, smelling the familiar aromas of roast turkey and stuffing, which should have felt comforting but instead only heightened my unease, every chuckle shared over the table echoing like an uninvited specter mocking me. When dessert was announced, I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as Jake was called upon to serve the pumpkin pie he had so wickedly insisted on preparing. I watched him slice it, the knife sliding through it like it was soft butter, revealing an unusual number of seeds embedded within, but no one else seemed bothered by it as they dove eagerly into their helpings, laughter fading to a low murmur as I glanced around the table, noticing Jake getting more animated as he spoke about this special pie, whispering how the recipe had been passed down for generations, but the glee in his voice had an unsettling edge I couldn't quite place. I felt compelled to try it, despite the gnawing voice in my head screaming for me to stop, so I reluctantly took a slice, the flavor exploding in my mouth, sweet yet somehow earthy, its richness unsettling yet addictive. As I swallowed, a dangerous lump formed in my throat, a panic rising when I caught Jake watching me, a smirk crossing his lips that sent icy tendrils snaking down my spine. The room felt claustrophobic, laughter morphing into distant chatter as I tried to maintain a smile, feeling the heaviness of the pie settle in my stomach like an anchor, each passing moment dragging me deeper into a pit of dread until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I stood abruptly, the sound of my chair scraping against the wooden floor tearing through the haze of conversation, and declared I was leaving, my heart racing as Jake's smile seemed to widen impossibly, genuine concern now masking a flicker of something darker. As I hurried out, I could hear my family's confused voices behind me, but all I could think was that I needed to get away from the house, the laughter that once filled it now sounding like derisive whispers in my ears. Storming out into the cool air, I felt both dizzy and wired, plunging into my car and slamming the door, my eyes darting back at the house lit up like a misplaced island of warmth in the dark, a beacon that now felt utterly sinister. It was only when I pulled out of the driveway that I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw Jake standing on the porch with a wide, sickening grin, the odd symbol from the recipe book now burned into my memory, and with every passing moment, the twisted reality began to settle in. What had he really put in that pie? I drove for what felt like hours, heart racing and mind racing faster, the thought of venturing back home making my stomach churn anew, but something inside told me to drive somewhere safe, somewhere normal. After pulling into the nearest gas station, I stumbled inside, seeking solace in the flickering fluorescent lights, but as I approached the cashier, my heart sank when I saw the subtle, knowing smirk on the cashier's face, his fingers idly tapping rhythmically on the counter almost like a signal, and everything that had felt odd lately crashed down on me, the feeling of familiarity, of dread, consuming me whole the second that cashier leaned forward and whispered, low and conspiratorial, "You shouldn't have left, the seed will find its way back to you." I bolted from the station, frantically spitting the words, "What did you mean?" into the window, but only the howling wind answered back, beckoning me home as the road stretched before me like a sinister path. When I finally returned home, the house loomed larger than before, shadows creeping across the porch like fingers grasping for the night. My family's laughter echoed again, but this time it felt warped, a cacophony of invasive whispers, relentlessly urging me to step inside. I pushed through the door and stepped into the dining room, where the remnants of our abandoned dinner remained. The pumpkin pie sat at the center, untouched and glistening in the dying light, looking more like a trophy than a dessert, and my family greeted me with smiles that felt jagged and twisted, eyes glinting as if they were anticipating something I was all too terrified to comprehend. There, at the head of the table, Jake's expression was almost a riddle, a puzzle formed of sinister delight, when he beckoned me forward, commanding me to take a seat, but every instinct within me screamed to run away. I could feel tendrils of darkness wrapping around my limbs, slowly pulling me down into the chair like glue, insistent, as the pie appeared to glare at me, glare with seated familiarity that echoed the night of shadows that still loomed over the house. The last thing I saw before everything spiraled into an unending void was Jake lifting the knife, that same wicked grin plastered across his face as he prepared to serve another slice, my scream of an unrecognizable foreboding cutting through the atmosphere, but dread pooled in my stomach as I knew, at that moment, the seed had begun to grow. AITA for refusing to go to my meals for dinner anymore. Most days, I feel guilty about it, but after the last experience, there's no way I can ever set foot in her house again. It started innocently enough. My husband and I had been married for a few years, and his mother insisted on hosting a weekly Sunday dinner. I used to enjoy those meals, filled with laughter and stories, but after the first incident, enjoyment shifted to dread. The first time it happened, we arrived to find the table lavishly set, but a deep chill permeated the air, something off, like stepping into a mausoleum. I brushed it off, chalked it up to an odd draft or maybe too many candles, but I swear it felt like we were being watched. As dinner began, my husband's mother started talking about her collection. Instead of dishes or porcelain cats, she was referring to disturbing shadows moving in the corners of her home, whispers that crept through the walls. "You must listen closely," she said, her voice dropping an octave as her eyes flickered to the corners. "They have stories to tell." I laughed nervously, hoping it was all a joke, but she was dead serious, her gaze drowning in something dark, almost tangible, and I shared an uneasy glance with my husband. I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. Dinner continued, each course more unsettling than the last, her smile curving like a crescent moon, and I found myself staring at the chicken, the skin too pale, almost sickly. The way it glistened under the light turned my stomach. As the evening wore on, I could feel a sinister presence lingering just outside the reach of my peripheral vision. After the meal, she insisted we look at her newest acquisition, leading us to a small, dusty room at the back of the house. Inside was a large mirror, its surface warped, the kind you see in horror movies. The reflections never quite match reality. My heart raced as she began to explain. She claimed the mirror reflected not just our images, but souls, capturing the essence of those within its grasp. My husband awkwardly laughed it off, but my skin prickled with unease. Then came the fateful moment. She said we should gather together before the mirror for a family picture, claiming it can bond us forever. My husband jokingly pushed his shoulders back, confidence evidently faltering as I hesitated, the air thickening, a weight pressing down on my chest as I moved closer. As the camera clicked, I felt something shift behind me. I turned and caught a flicker of movement, something dark and serpentine writhing against the wall. I gasped, but when I looked again, it was gone, dissolved into the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but I could sense something watching. We hurried out after that, but not without an overwhelming guilt for my sudden sense of dread. When we visited the following week, I could feel the strange tension ballooning. The air at the dinner table felt tight, like a noose, everything a stifling echo of the past. My mother-in-law, ever so perceptive, picked up on my discomfort. "Do you see them?" she whispered during dessert, her eyes glinting with a strange fervor. For a moment, panic clawed at my throat. I didn't want to admit to any unseen horrors. "See? What?" I responded with a trembling voice, and she only smiled wider, revealing far too many teeth. That night, I couldn't shake an icy grip wrapping around my spine. I had horrific nightmares of dark figures closing in, whispering my name, clawing at the edges of my sanity. It felt so real, and when I woke up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, I resolved to tell my husband I couldn't go back. He took it poorly, surprised by my sudden shift, but I urged him to listen. I knew something was very wrong, but he just laughed it off, chalking it up to an overstimulating imagination. The following week, I decided to confront her. "I don't want to come to dinner anymore," I stated flatly. Her face contorted, suddenly aging before my eyes, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. "But the others? The family needs you," she hissed, and at that moment, her eyes darkened until they were like two voids, and I remembered every ghostly whisper she had let linger in the air. I racked my brain to think of an excuse, any reason to get out of it, but the second I did, she gripped my wrist with a surprising ferocity, and I felt a jolt of sickness clawing my insides. "You're one of us now, you belong to the collection," her voice was low, rumbling from deep within her. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand free. I told my husband I couldn't do this any longer, that I couldn't bear to be part of an acquisition or collection, that I needed peace away from those dreadful dinners. It was easier said than done. Eventually, he accepted my request, albeit begrudgingly. But every now and then, he would ask me why I was being unreasonable, why I couldn't just come back for one dinner. My resolve was tested again when weeks passed, and I started to sense a strange displacement at home, an emptiness settling over our lives. My husband habitually mentioned how much his mother missed me, and with time, I could see shadows again, thicker than before, creeping along the walls at night, creeping into my dreams. My sleep was invaded by visions of dark reflections whispering my name, twisting and warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I began hearing muffled words drifting through the air, begging me to return, to join them, but I fought against it, focusing on the love that had once surrounded us. That's when I found the pictures. I was looking through an old family album when I stumbled upon our last photo taken before the mirror. My heart dropped as I studied the photograph. My husband was smiling, but behind him, I could see it, an inky shadow, clawing and stretching out of the periphery, its eyes glinting with malicious intent. I showed the picture to my husband, but he only shook his head, unable to see what I saw through the darkness. Despair clawed at me. How could I return to that dinner table and face those malicious whispers again? That night, I laid awake, trying to rationalize it all when I heard it. Whispering, insistent, calling for me. They were back, the dark figures pressing in closer until I couldn't breathe. In my desperation to escape, I ran to our bedroom mirror, and there, in the reflection, was my mother-in-law, her face twisted and that ghastly smile, a prism of shadows coiling around her as she spoke. "You belong to the collection, sweet girl," she hissed, and with every sip of breath, the shadows deepened, encroaching not just in the mirror reflection but swallowing me into a maelstrom of darkness. I cried out, tore myself away from the mirror, icy fingers chasing me, chasing the hollow pit in my stomach. I made the worst decision ever. I called my husband to come see it. He needed to understand. But when he hurried to my side, she was gone, the mirror only reflecting my panic-stricken face. The whispers intensified, and I gasped as the reflections began to shape into the forms of those I didn't recognize, past family dinners replaying shadows of forgotten loves, lost souls trapped in that grim essence. As I bolted out of the mirror's gaze, dread enveloped me, and a horrifying truth surged as I grasped the reality. That mirror was a trap, an ancient device luring me into her collection, binding me with the dark remnants of her family that would never let me go. I knew, without a single doubt, returning meant becoming part of that burgeoning collection forever, and that's when I finally understood AITA for refusing to go to my mills for dinner anymore. No, I was simply fighting to keep my soul intact. Last summer, I moved into a small neighborhood where everyone seemed friendly at first, but things took a bizarre turn after I had a confrontation with my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. It all started when I casually mentioned to him, while he was washing his yard gnomes, how I preferred parking in my designated spot because it was the only small power I had in the chaos of moving into a new place. He chuckled, waving his sponge like a wand, and assured me he understood my plight. But weeks later, I got the unmistakable vibe that he didn't. Each night after work, I'd come home to find his dented old pickup parked in my spot, encroaching on my territory like a predator marking its territory. Feeling bold one evening, I knocked on his door, my heart thumping violently, and explained my frustration. He grinned wider than any normal person could, his smile stretching across his face until it felt like it threatened to split him open. "It's just a spot," he said, a hint of something darker threading through his placid demeanor, like oil slicking through water. I had to sleep on it before responding because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The following week, I returned home to find his truck occupying my space yet again, and with it, I felt a surge of familiar dread, though I couldn't quite place why. That night, a heavy storm washed over the neighborhood, accompanied by howling winds that rattled windows and sent branches skittering across the pavement. In the middle of my insomnia-fueled anxiety, I thought I heard someone tapping at my window. Peeking through the blinds, I was shocked to see Mr. Thompson standing there, drenched, his face smeared with rain and shadows, that same smile plastered on, more disturbing than ever. He called my name in this playful sing-song voice, but I swear, behind his eyes was something twisted, as if a different creature was behind them. Terrified, I yanked away from the window, hoping he'd disappear, praying for the dawn to come and that everything would just make sense again. The next morning, filled with anxiety-induced bravado, I marched back to his house to confront him fully. His wife, a ghostly figure I rarely saw, answered, her eyes glazed over as if she was looking through the world. I asked her if Mr. Thompson had come home last night, and she blinked at me, slowly, then in a flat voice said he was out working late at the greenhouse. I didn't even know he had one. Confused and feeling a sense of foreboding, I repeated the words in my head like a mantra as I took note of the strange plant-shaped shadows lurking at the edge of his yard. Days passed, and each evening he blocked my parking spot again until I snapped. I marched over, my blood hot and my hands trembling, and confronted him in front of his wife, who just stood there, slack-jawed. "You need to stop parking in my space," I shouted, the sunlight flickering through the leaves casting an eerie glow on us, and for once, Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that cut deep as if he weighed the consequence of my existence. He leaned closer, the air around him growing thick, and that's when I noticed how strange he smelled, like fresh soil and something rotten, before muttering something I couldn't comprehend, words that slithered into an unnatural hiss. I backed away slowly, hurriedly retreating home, but the very next day, I found my car's tires slashed, neatly done with the precision of a surgeon. Fear crept through me as I watched that cursed pickup parked yet again in my designated spot later that night. Deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I filed a complaint with the HOA, but nothing came of it. Apparently, they were quite fond of Mr. Thompson and had no reason to believe my story. In an act of desperate folly, I turned to social media and connected with a local group about neighborhood issues, sharing my strange, escalating situation. Surprisingly, others chimed in with their strange experiences of him. People spoke of unsettling artworks made of nature's remnants that he gifted them, of their pets going missing. The fear blossomed into something all-consuming, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that Mr. Thompson was somehow connected to the missing pets, perhaps a sacrifice to the odd, twisted plants that apparently thrived in his mysterious greenhouse. Then, on a particularly tense night, I heard rustling outside my house, followed by soft whispering. Peering outside, my stomach dropped. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing among the shadows with some others, figures I didn't recognize, as they circled something low to the ground. The dim light caught the glimmer of a long, slender object that glistened like a knife. Before I could catch my breath, they turned in unison, their expressions becoming warped, contorted mixtures of glee and malevolence, eyes shining like bleached bone, and I stumbled backward, panic spiking, the dark veil of night swallowing me whole. I resolved to end this once and for all. I waited until the next evening, finally gathering enough courage to sneak into his backyard. I needed proof. Just as I ducked beneath the overgrown vines, there it was, the greenhouse, more like a mausoleum, shrouded in darkness, where the air felt heavy with secrets. Peering through the glass, I could barely breathe. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside lay not just plants but fragments of what looked unmistakably like the missing pets, their fur woven intricately amidst the foliage in a reverent show of grotesque artistry. Bottles of dark liquid lined the shelves, and I realized I had stumbled upon something far worse than mere vengeance over a parking spot. They had turned into something sinister, a cult dedicated to reclaiming life through bizarre rituals, and suddenly, my car didn't seem like an innocent dispute anymore, it was an offering of insidious attention. I slipped back home, heart pounding in rhythm to my blind terror, attempting to rationalize what I'd seen but knowing deep down there was a price to pay. Despite my fears, I couldn't let him continue getting away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had inadvertently become the centerpiece of their twisted offering, the outsider whose boundaries they would not respect. I dug deeper into local lore and found a chilling story of disappearances linked to a green thumb that preyed on the naive and unsuspecting, a sordid tale of nature reclaiming itself through blood and bone. By the end of that cursed week, I was determined to leave, sneaking out under the cover of dawn, but when I got to my car, I saw at least 5 gnarled, vine-like tendrils creeping from beneath, wrapping around my tires and digging into the earth-like roots. Looking up, I froze in place. There was Mr. Thompson, inches away, that same smile stretched across his face, wild approval dancing in his eyes. "It's just a spot," he whispered, voice smooth and filled with eager resonance. In that moment, I understood what I'd become, just another lost soul to nourish his insatiable craving for dominance over life, held captive with the realization that the only way to escape this otherworldly nightmare would be to surrender my life as a tribute, the very sacrifice that would grant him what he sought. And as he leaned closer, inviting me deeper into the darkness, I screamed internally, realizing I was trapped in a game with no escape, with no answers. AITA for asking him not to park in my spot? It turns out that in this twisted web of existence, sometimes the rules aren't just for parking spaces, they're about survival. AITA for suggesting my teacher host my son's party at her house? It all started innocently enough. My son Ethan had turned 8, and in the excitement of planning his birthday party, I wanted to make it unforgettable. After all, this was the age where friendships began to solidify, and I wanted Ethan to feel special. I had toyed with the idea of renting a hall or throwing a backyard barbecue, but nothing felt quite right. It needed a personal touch, something more intimate. That's when I remembered Ms. Keller, Ethan's 3rd grade teacher, who had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had a way of bringing magic into mundane lessons, turning math classes into treasure hunts and history into exciting adventures, and I thought, why not? It was a bit of a stretch, but her massive Victorian-style house, filled with books and nooks, could be the perfect backdrop for a meaningful gathering. I approached her after school one day, my heart pounding in my chest, and suggested it as a wild idea. To my surprise, she considered it. Her smile softened into something more contemplative, as she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and nodded thoughtfully, but she never agreed. Weeks passed, and the conversation slipped from memory until I received a text from her, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, where she revealed she had been thinking about hosting the party at her house after all, citing how her own children loved the space. My heart soared. It was the answer I'd dreamed of, and I quickly agreed. The days leading up to the party were filled with excitement and anticipation. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed, I felt like I was on top of the world, relishing the fact that my crazy idea had manifested into reality. Then, the night of the party came. The kids flooded into Ms. Keller's grand home, laughter echoed through her hallways, filled with the sweet scent of homemade cookies and the sound of balloons popping. I was caught up in a whirlwind of joy, glancing at Ms. Keller, who seemed to glide effortlessly between the children, her voice a gentle breeze among the giggles, until everything took a strange turn. Around 9, when half the kids were exhausted, I noticed Ethan drifting toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar, hesitant fingers reaching for the handle. "Ethan, no." I called out, the warning tearing from my lips as I rushed toward him, a sudden chill creeping into my veins. Ms. Keller was right behind me, her smile flickering as she gently reprimanded him, offering a promise of games and laughter above, but the glint in her eyes turned steely for the briefest second, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. I dismissed the incident, attributing my unease to exhaustion, and helped set up the cake. But the atmosphere thickened as the night wore on, the joyous laughter stagnant against an ill wind that seemed to seep in from nowhere. I watched as one by one, the children began to act strangely. They would pause mid-laugh, eyes wide as if something had whispered their names. The cake remained untouched, and the adults murmured amongst themselves, glancing nervously at the basement door that somehow drew attention like a gaping maw ready to swallow the unwary. It creaked open again, and I lost my breath when I saw tiny shadows moving in the dimness, figures that looked like children but were all wrong, limbs out of proportion, faces stretched or twisted in unnatural ways. One child, my neighbor's son, stumbled back up the stairs and pointed a trembling finger toward the door, and I suddenly realized none of the kids had gone in, but rather, something had come out. Ms. Keller quickly ushered them away, her demeanor shifting, sternness painting her features. I was struck by a sense of dread deeper than fear. I fumbled for my phone, frantically attempting to call the police when Ms. Keller approached, an unsettling calm settling over her. "Everything's fine, really," she said, her voice smooth like honey but edged with steel, "just let them play." Then she looked beyond me and smiled, but I could feel it, a wave of malevolence rolling off her as the basement door creaked open wider, and a chilling breeze clawed at my back. Panic bubbled up inside me as I gripped Ethan's arm and started toward the door, but the children were transfixed, eyes locked on the darkness below. "You're being silly," Ms. Keller whispered with a hint of irritation, glancing over at the basement while the lights flickered ominously. "They just want to play a game." I felt the icy grip of dread tighten around me. The playfulness of the party had warped into something grotesque, as if the children were entranced by the shadowed figures whispering promises they could not resist. I turned and bolted for the door, dragging Ethan with me, but behind me, I could hear Miss Keller's sweet voice laced with something sinister. "Ethan, we have so much more fun to have down here," she beckoned, her tone shifting like the wind, and everything in me screamed to flee. I yanked him toward the exit just as chaos erupted. The children screamed, not in delight but in pure terror as the twisted forms slinked further into the light, and the laughter turned into shrieks. I burst through the front door, practically tearing Ethan into the night as the darkness behind me stirred, shadows swirling like tempests through Ms. Keller's home. The last thing I saw before slamming the door shut was her eyes, two glimmering voids that seemed to absorb both light and life. We didn't stop running until we reached our car parked at the end of the street, panting and gasping as I shoved Ethan into the passenger seat, fumbling for my keys. It wasn't until we were far away, the glow of Miss Keller's charming house in the distance, that I dared to glance at him, and when I did, everything felt wrong. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but a strange, otherworldly calm, and I realized with dawning horror that he had begun to mimic the same expression I had seen on those twisted children. I glanced back at him, trying to shake off the terror, desperate to hold on to the warmth of normalcy, and as the night deepened around us, doubt crept in. Did I just ruin my son's birthday, or had I unwittingly invited something far worse? I shuddered thinking of Ms. Keller, now a blend of menace and charm, waiting at the edge of darkness for another innocent soul, and with each mile, a single thought screamed in my mind: was this all my fault? The moment I stepped into my classroom that dreary Thursday morning, I could feel a heaviness in the air, a tension coiling like a serpent about to strike, and as the morning sun struggled to filter through the grimy windows, my heart sank when I noticed a sea of students excitedly whispering in the corners, their eyes darting towards Sophia, a bright-eyed, hopeful 15-year-old with an infectious smile that often lit up the room. She had been dreaming of her quinceañera for years, a celebration of her transition into womanhood, and as her teacher, I could see the crescendo of her hopes building with each passing day, especially as she summoned the courage to approach me after class, a breathless determination etched across her face as she asked if I would help her plan it. My instincts screamed at me that something was amiss. Rumors whispered through the halls, hints of troubles at home that not even I, the well-meaning teacher, could unravel fully, but I nodded, a slight encouragement at the corners of my mouth. I agreed to help with the decorations and even promised I'd talk to the administration about allowing her to use the school gym for the event. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the excitement around her quince spiraled into something resembling fairy tale hype among the students, I couldn't shake the growing unease that shadowed my heart, fueled by encounters I had with her family's financial struggles. When Sophia, glowing and radiant, approached me the following week to finalize some of the plans, I hesitated, the weight of uncertainty clutching at my throat, and when I muttered that I wasn't sure if she could have the quince due to potential issues stemming from her family background, the air thickened, her smile faltered, the color drained from her cheeks like someone had pulled the plug on her dream. A stunned silence fell over the classroom, the other students leaning in, wide-eyed, and I tried to clarify myself, to retract my words, but the damage was done. She turned on her heel and fled, leaving behind an echo of disbelief. From that moment on, I felt a shift. The whispers grew louder, not just amongst the students, but I could feel the chastising stares of the faculty, their judgment as corrosive as acid, speculating if I crushed a girl's aspirations with a careless comment. Days slipped by in a haze of regret, Sophia avoiding my gaze, her laughter replaced with a sorrowful hush, and just when I thought I might make amends, I was hit with an email from the school's principal informing me that Sophia's family had withdrawn her from school, effective immediately. Panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to reach out, to apologize, to let her know I never meant to upset her, but the digital void was deafening, a complete stop to all communication, and I was left to wonder if my offhanded comment had spiraled into something far darker than I could comprehend, until one night, after tossing and turning under blankets of regret, I received a chilling email from Sophia herself. The subject line read simply, "You were right," and as I opened it, I felt ice peel back the layers of my guilt. The email revealed that her home life had grown increasingly chaotic, her family struggling with unseen demons, her father losing his job, the celebratory dresses replaced with hunger pangs, and buried within the paragraphs was something that made my heart lurch. She wrote of a plan to reclaim her narrative, to find hope amidst the shadows that threatened to consume her entire existence, and as I read her words, the line blurred between despair and resolve, making me question my own role, my own cruel insensitivity, for I realized too late that my uncertainty had not only cast a cloud over her quinceañera but had transformed into something far more sinister. It had unwittingly exposed a fracture that ran deeper, something I never grasped until it was too late. The email concluded with just a single question: is there really a chance for me? The sorrow woven through her words struck me, coursed through my veins like a wildfire, igniting a desperation to reach out and guide her, but when I tried, my emails bounced back. Her family had severed all ties, pulling her from the world that had become too oppressive, too unforgiving, and it struck me like an axe splintering wood. My hope for her future had become twisted with every moment I'd let my doubts fester and grow, leaving me with a shrouded understanding in the silence that followed her departure. The echoes of laughter that once filled my classroom were replaced by an eerie stillness, and as I sat, the burden of guilt settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat, I couldn't help but wonder if I had not only become a stranger in her life but a ghost in my own, a cautionary tale of how a thoughtless remark, even in the name of caution, could chip away at the dreams of someone so young, trapped in the shadows of their own despair. All because I had been too afraid to believe in the chances that flickered like a distant candle, extinguished by my own doubts. Every year during summer break, my family and I head to our favorite lakeside cabin, a place marked by its tranquility and untouched beauty. It's always been a retreat from the chaos of life, but this last trip took a turn that still keeps me up at night. We arrived late on a Friday, just as a thunderstorm began to roll in, dark clouds brewing ominously over the mountains. My parents settled, and while I grabbed my backpack and headed to the rickety old pier, hoping to catch a moment of calm before the storm hit. As I stood staring out at the choppy water, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to see a girl, maybe a year or two younger than me, her auburn hair drenched by the rain, and her eyes wide as if she had somehow slipped into a different reality. Without a word, she motioned for me to follow her down the pier. Intrigued but slightly uneasy, I obeyed, as if bound by some invisible thread. She walked with a purpose until we reached the end, where the distance from land felt surreal, as if we were standing on the edge of the world. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Just then, the sky split with a blinding flash of lightning, and I jumped, splashing into the murky water below. The last thing I remember was the girl's scream as I felt the cold envelop me, sinking deeper until everything went black. When I came to, I was gasping for air, my chest heaving as I clawed my way back to the surface. I looked around frantically for the girl, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I pulled myself onto the pier, soaked and terrified, but a part of me felt something I can only describe as wrong, a whispering dread that knotted in my stomach. I noticed the weather had gone eerily calm, the storm clouds dissipating as the sun peeked through the trees. Shivering, I hurried back to the cabin, brushing off my encounter as a strange dream. The next morning, the sun shone bright, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as we went hiking along the scenic trails. It was there I overheard my parents casually talking about a little girl who had gone missing 2 summers ago, last seen near the lake. They said she had drowned, and with a chill, I wondered if this was the girl I had met. Later that evening, while my family played games inside, curiosity gnawed at me, and I slipped back down to the lake. The bright moon hung low in the sky, casting shimmering silvery light on the water, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was meant to be there. I called out, hoping to hear that girl's voice again, but only silence answered. Suddenly, I heard splashing, and then whispering. The whispers turned into chants as other shadows emerged from the woods. Their faces were obscured, and it felt like they were both there and not there. They pointed at me, demanding I join them in their fray, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. That girl appeared again, her face twisted in anguish, as if pleading for help, and I felt an uncontrollable impulse to step forward. But as I did, an unseen force pulled me back, and I resisted. That's when I heard it, a voice from the shadows, sickly and sweet, taunting, "You could save her, but it will cost you your joy." I couldn't understand, my heart racing as I felt the shadows drawing closer. Panic surged, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I turned and ran, bolting back towards the safety of the cabin, my mind flooded with the realization that I could never return to the lake. The following day, my family checked out a bit earlier, perhaps sensing my distress. I kept having nightmares about that girl, about the shadows lingering by the lake. Days turned into weeks, and I convinced myself it was all just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the summer blues. But then came the phone call. It was a local news report about the lake. A girl had gone missing once again. She fit the same description as the girl from my summer. My heart dropped, and guilt washed over me, the kind that feels like a lead weight dragging you down. Could I have saved her? The thought gnawed at me, but deep down, the whispers in my head urged me to let it go, telling me I was being ridiculous. Still, I couldn't shake that eerie connection, feeling as if I had witnessed something I shouldn't have. My dreams grew darker, filled with shadows and whispers, and I wouldn't let myself swim anywhere near that lake again. As summer bled into fall, I tried to put it all behind me, but one night, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post that made my blood run cold, a photograph of that girl, smiling brightly, captioned, "Missing, please help us find her." Only this time, the comments were filled with those same shadowy figures from my dreams, claiming they could help, that they knew where she was. I barely slept that night, haunted by the thought that I had left her behind. And then, without warning, the shadows came back. They invaded every corner of my mind, filling my thoughts with despair and fear until the following summer rolled around, and my parents announced we'd be heading back to the cabin. My heart raced at the thought, and despite feeling unwell, I couldn't let my parents know. I had to face whatever darkness awaited me. When we arrived, everything seemed normal, no signs of the girl, just peace and quiet, the lake shimmering under a golden sunset. I convinced myself I was imagining it all until that very first night. I went for a walk along the pier and, as soon as I stepped onto the dock, I felt it, the cold breath on my neck and the whisper of a name, urging me forward. Ignoring every logical reason, I walked to the end of the pier, and there she was, emerging from the depths of the water, her pale face shimmering under the gathering moonlight, the shadows twisting around her sorrowful eyes. "Help me," she begged, her voice echoing across the water, and I felt my resolve crumble. I stepped closer, reaching my hand out, but that's when the shadows bubbled up, swallowing her whole as their whispers turned into a deafening roar. "You should have saved her," they cried, and I finally stumbled back, horrified beyond comprehension. My body felt frozen, my breath caught in my throat, as reality shattered. I dropped to the ground, overwhelmed by a flood of sorrow as my tears cascaded like rain. Suddenly, the girl emerged from the depths again, and she cried, but this time the sound pierced deep into my soul, ripping me apart, leaving me bare. "You let me drown," she screamed, her voice merging with the shadows. I felt like I was being tossed between worlds, lost in their twisted grasp. Finally breaking free from the haze, I turned and bolted back to the cabin, knowing that I could no longer live in denial. The next morning, I gathered my courage and confessed to my parents, hoping against hope they could help me understand, but they only looked at me with concern, brushing off my tales as a youthful imagination. They didn't understand what I had witnessed or felt, nobody ever did. Days went by, each one cementing the dread that had taken root in my heart, and when the time came for us to leave, I knew with clarity, I'd be forever haunted by that girl's anguish, an echo of guilt that would never fade. I boarded the car, every thought consumed by shadows, the whispers now entwined with my own thoughts, haunting me relentlessly. "You should have saved her," they taunted, their voices familiar yet alien, sending shivers down my spine, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but look back at the lake, the last vestiges of sunlight catching its surface, that eternal stillness reflecting a million stars above, and I screamed at the top of my lungs, a desperate plea to whatever forces lingered in the dark waters, "I am so sorry." But I knew then, it would never be enough to drown out the silence that followed. I've never thought I'd question my own sanity, but last summer changed everything. It all started when my best friend, Sarah, announced her engagement. Sarah was someone I grew up with, and we've shared everything from childhood secrets to adult heartbreaks, so when she asked me to be her maid of honor, I felt honored but terrified. The wedding was grand, extravagant by every measure, and I wanted everything to be perfect for her. That's when the dress came into the picture. The moment I saw it, I felt my stomach tighten. The floor-length silk gown was beautiful, but the plunging neckline and sheer sides left little to the imagination. For someone like me, who never felt comfortable in the spotlight, it was a nightmare. As if sensing my hesitation, Sarah insisted I look like a hot bridesmaid because the dress is meant to show off our beauty. I felt like a prop rather than a person, a mere decoration for Sarah's fairy tale, and as I stared at the dress hanging in my closet, I realized I couldn't bring myself to wear it. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands, literally, sneaking some fabric from a craft store to alter the dress a bit. Nothing drastic, just enough to cover my shoulders and up the neckline slightly. I felt guilty but convinced myself that it was okay since I was still honoring the essence of the dress but adapting it to my own comfort. The night before the wedding, I stayed up late, stitching away, feeling proud of myself until dread settled in. What if Sarah saw it? Would she flip? I told myself that all would be fine, that this was just for me, for my confidence, but as I slipped into that gown the next day, I felt a chill run down my spine like I was about to walk into a lion's den. The venue was filled with laughter and shimmering lights, and the moment I stepped through the entrance, I could feel all eyes on me. But instead of ridicule or judgment, I saw nods of approval, murmured compliments about how elegant I looked. It was euphoric until I spotted Sarah, who stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief, her mouth moving but the words lost in the frantic music around us. Before I could process her reaction, she stormed over to me, seething. "Did you alter my dress?" she asked through gritted teeth, her voice devoid of warmth. I stammered, trying to explain how it was too revealing for my taste, but her expression hardened further. "You weren't supposed to change anything, this is my wedding." I felt the temperature in the room drop, and it became painfully clear that her dream of perfect bridesmaids and perfection had been shattered by someone who dared to adapt their own version of beauty. As she dragged me outside, the laughter from the party faded into a distant echo, and it felt like I was about to be sentenced. "You made a mockery of me," she whispered fiercely. A part of me wanted to yell back, to explain that it was about comfort, not mockery, but all of the words seemed trapped in my throat. Before I could speak, she turned and raced back inside, leaving me outside, alone amidst the fading light. The next hour was a whirlwind of chaotic emotions. It disrupted the flow of the wedding entirely, while I stood there, shaking, feeling like a pariah. Guests started casting sideways glances in my direction, some whispering, while others just outright stared. That's when the uncertainty morphed into something darker. I knew I had crossed a line. The coldness from Sarah seeped deeper inside me as I replayed our confrontation and my own insecurity that led to this moment. Was I really the villain in this story? Or was I merely trying to reclaim a piece of my one fading sense of self at the expense of someone else's happiness? After the ceremony, I retreated to the bathroom, convinced I needed to gather my thoughts, but as I approached the mirror, I noticed something uncanny about my reflection. My altered dress, the fabric I thought was meant to help me, seemed to distort my own likeness in an almost grotesque manner. The neckline I was proud of now began to look jagged and monstrous, the sleeves felt like chains wrapping around me, pulling tighter and tighter. I blinked, and for a fleeting moment, I swore I saw another face, a twisted, smirking mask that looked like me but wasn't. I staggered back, suddenly feeling like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare. Shaking my head, I took a breath, reassured myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but the fear crawled deeper into my bones. When I finally left the bathroom, I found the reception room in chaos. Sarah was surrounded by a group of bridesmaids, enraged faces all around her, casting accusatory glances at me like I was the villain in their beloved tale. The apprehension in the air was palpable, every laugh a bit too sharp, every cheer unnaturally loud. Before I could even register what was happening, I heard whispers form into words, accusing me of sabotaging the wedding, of making my insecurities the focus of Sarah's big day, as if I was some attention seeker reveling in the chaos I'd concocted. In those moments, I felt their judgment slice through me like a dagger, and that's when I caught sight of my own reflection in the highly polished plates scattered across the tables. I looked at the corrupted image of myself in the dress, and suddenly it struck me, I wasn't merely altering a dress, I was trying to alter my reality, to fit into a world where I didn't belong, where beauty meant something else entirely, something that warped my very sense of being. The music played on, the chaos intensified, and I felt a desperate urge to escape, to shed the skin of my own creation. I turned and fled while they continued to hurl insults behind me, the laughter losing its warmth, becoming a cruel echo that taunted my every step. That night was a blur, a prison of my own making that left me shaken, haunted by the reflection of what I had become. The next morning, Sarah and I spoke. She never forgave me, claiming I ruined her day, that I should have understood the importance of sacrifices for the sake of friendship. But as we parted ways, I couldn't shake the feeling that my desire to alter that dress, to claim my own narrative, had unleashed something far more sinister. I'd broken a bond not just with her, but with a version of myself who sought acceptance in a world where the beauty seems so unforgiving, and I became a specter of that night, roaming through my thoughts, knowing in the deepest chambers of my mind that sometimes, you might not just alter a dress, you might alter the very fabric of who you are, and in doing so, you risk losing everything that you held dear. I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life. His fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear. She had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me. It was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, AITA for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. AITA for using the word consent against my mother? I never thought I'd find myself typing this on a late Tuesday night, but here I am, heart racing, fingers trembling on the keyboard, desperate for some semblance of understanding about what just transpired in my life. It all started when I decided to visit my parents for the weekend. I hadn't been home in months, and I could sense my mom's disdain through the intermittent phone calls I received, filled with thinly veiled remarks about how I'd just forgotten about them. So, with a mix of guilt and nostalgia, I packed my bags and drove the 2 hours back to the house I grew up in, the place that held a billion memories, both good and bad. As I pulled into the driveway, a chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off as anxiety. After all, who really wants to discuss their life choices over dinner? My mom greeted me with her usual overbearing affection, hugging me tightly, her perfume cloying yet familiar, and I felt the knot of tension in my stomach slowly start to unravel. We chatted over dinner, the conversation light and predictable, until the topic shifted to my love life, a subject my mother tends to tackle using a hammer instead of a scalpel. She pressed me, asked questions I didn't want to answer, and her probing took on a sharp edge that I eventually pushed back against. That's when I uttered the word consent. It slipped out during an argument after she told me to pick better partners. I just couldn't take her lecture anymore. I said something like, "Mom, it's my life. I get to choose who I want to be with, and I need your consent to make me feel worthy." It wasn't meant to hurt her, but the air changed in an instant. Her face darkened, a look I had never seen before, as if I had slammed a door in her face, a door I didn't even know existed until that moment. Silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. My mother's eyes shimmered with a complex blend of hurt and rage, and she took a step back, her breath hitching as if someone had stolen the air from her lungs. I couldn't comprehend what had happened. All I knew was that I had crossed a line that I hadn't even known was there. It was a conversation spiraling completely out of control, and before I could backtrack or even apologize, she screamed. "You think you can use that word against me? You think I don't know what consent means? I didn't give birth to you just for you to throw it back in my face." I was taken aback, utterly stunned. Her face had grown pale, her features tightly coiled like a snake preparing to strike. In that moment, I felt a mix of anger and defiance as I shot back, "I'm just saying that consent goes both ways, Mom. You can't control my life, and this guilt trip is not what healthy parenting looks like." The tension suffocated the room, and that storm-clouded silence fell over us again, thick with resentment and suppressed emotions. I half expected her to storm out, to slam a door, but she stood there, trembling, looking like a portrait of shattered pride. It became painfully clear that this had triggered something deeper, something hidden beneath layers of our past. So I did what I thought was right, hoping to take the narrative back into my hands. I reached out, trying to connect, desperate to clear the air. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that," I pleaded, but my words were met with a blank stare, and suddenly she whispered a name that sent a shockwave through my body, my grandmother's. She used to say consent is why I had to fight for you, why I had to endure pain, so you could be free. Those words felt like ice piercing through my veins. It was like she had opened a door I never knew existed. My grandmother had always been a mysterious figure, a woman who had endured much and left behind stories that were always shrouded in whispers. I searched my mother's face for any hint of explanation, but instead, she crumbled into tears and I watched, horrified, as years of unspoken grievances poured out. She started to tell me about her childhood, how my grandmother had made choices that had shackled her to an unhappy marriage and a life of regret, all born from a warped sense of broken consent she could never escape, and I sat there, frozen, overwhelmed by sadness for a past I couldn't touch. "I was supposed to be your protector," she sobbed, "but it all feels so twisted. I never wanted you to feel the same pain I did." In an instant, I realized the true weight of what I had said. Our entire lives were entangled in these invisible threads, stretching across generations. It wasn't just about our conversation anymore, it was history echoing through the walls of our family home. It became clear that the word consent had opened a Pandora's box of unhealed wounds and buried sorrows. I thought I was just standing up for myself, but instead, I was confronting a legacy of pain I never fully understood. I held her tightly, both of us enveloped in tears, and for the first time, we acknowledged the silent cries of our past. But even within that embrace, a part of me knew that this revelation wouldn't be the end. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey we would have to navigate together, facing truths that could rip families apart or, maybe, for the first time, bring us closer. So, now I sit here questioning myself, wondering, AITA? Part of me feels guilt for awakening this dark past in my mother, another part knows if I hadn't said anything, we may have remained stuck in our silence. Maybe, in breaking the chain, I was finally breaking free. It was a rainy Saturday morning, and the small coffee shop on the corner was packed, mirroring the storm outside with its chaotic energy. I managed to snag the last table, a tiny two-seater with a view of the dripping city streets, just as the door swung open to let in a gust of wind and a figure I would soon come to regret. She stumbled in, a wild-haired woman in a tattered raincoat, her face obscured by a tangle of frizzy curls, and for an instant, everything around me fell silent. She hovered in the doorway like some tragic specter. I caught a whiff of her as she approached the counter to order, and it hit me like a brick wall: sweat, rot and something I couldn't quite place, a medley of unkempt days stacked one atop the other like trash piling up in a back alley. I instinctively retracted my shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the people left standing in the queue, but they all wore expressions of discomfort, mirroring my own. Every instinct told me to maintain my distance. Her essence intruded upon the coffee shop's warm, cinnamon-tinged ambience. I was already watching people navigate between the tables, searching for a place to sit, and as I sipped cautiously on my overly sweet vanilla latte, I hoped she would find a corner where her smell wouldn't reach me. But life is never that simple. She approached my table, draped her coat over the back of the chair opposite me, and smiled a toothy grin that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Is this seat taken?" she chirped, and the pit in my stomach deepened as the aroma clung to the air around us, a thick, suffocating blanket that made my brain scream for escape. I wanted to be polite, to tell her I was waiting for someone, but the words caught in my throat, twisted by the harsh reality of her scent clinging to every surface. Instead, I cleared my throat, forcing a strained smile. "Actually, I'm just waiting for a friend," I replied, emphasizing the word friend like it was a sacred charm. She blinked and leaned in closer, the stench intensifying as if she had inhaled all the miseries of the world and exhaled them right in my direction. "Oh, come on, there's no need for that," she said, her voice a strange mix of persistence and desperation that instantly spat in the face of my discomfort. "It's a crowded place, just a quick sit until they find a seat." I felt my throat tighten further. I wanted to rise like a ghost, but the warmth of the latte paled in comparison to the cold, invading anxiety clawing at my chest. I could feel the eyes around us narrow in scrutiny, silently judging me, and I knew that I had to stand my ground because the alternative was unthinkable. I shook my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. I'm sorry, but I really can't. I need some space. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the whole cafe held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Her expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a flicker of indignation igniting beneath the surface of her frazzled exterior. You're really going to turn me away? Just because of how I smell? She hissed, her voice dropping low yet piercing, echoing between tables, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and muted chatter that seemed to suddenly fade into mere background noise. My chest tightened, caught between a wave of guilt and the suffocating dread of being captured by her discomfort. I wanted to scream to the world that I wasn't the bad guy here, that this wasn't about her as a person, that my senses were fighting a losing battle against her reality. But it was too late. In her narrowed eyes, I saw the slow dawning realization that I might be one of the few people refusing to let her presence invade their space. She sat back, huffing, shoulders slumping, tail between her legs. I could tell she felt it, the weight of her own isolation, the lack of kindness in an unfriendly world, but I was drowning, gasping for clean air. That's when she leaned forward again, eyes alight with something indefinable, an unsettling spark swirling behind them. You know, there's a name for people like you. They call you made of money and you turn your back on someone who just needs to rest. You won't remember this moment, you'll move on with your perfect, clean life while I'm left here in the dirt you won't even acknowledge. I braced myself for a possible outburst, but every moment of tension bent its spine back upon itself, wrapping the room in an atmosphere thick with anticipation. I wanted to hurl my guilt at her, to explain that I didn't have a perfect life, I had bills that made me sweat in my sleep and deadlines that haunted me. But her words cut deeper, and I found myself staring down into my latte, the froth swirling like crowded thoughts in my mind as shame crept over me like a thief in the night. I'm not the bad guy here, I attempted to insist, voice trembling with uncertainty and helplessness, but I was drowning in her eyes, the raw emotion behind them flaying the fabric of my justification. Then, slowly, she straightened, mouth a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of someone who found joy, it was the brittle kind that echoed of deep wounds and ancient hurts that made me wonder how often had she been ridiculed in this very way. Anger flared briefly at the edge of my thoughts, casting shadows of self-doubt into the void. Was I really the monster I'd been painted to be? The onlookers shifted in discomfort. It appeared to be a performance now, a spectator's sport of empathy versus survival. The barista even paused as she made cappuccinos, casting sideways glances at us as the mayhem unfolded. I wish I could have shrunk down into the woven fabric of the chair, to escape the twisted narrative taking form. You know what, she said finally, a dangerous confidence threading her voice, you might think you're better than me now, but if you saw what I saw, if you felt what I feel, you'd run screaming into the night. My stomach churned as her words slithered into my mind, sharp and sinuous, and I did not want to imagine. We were worlds apart, yet standing in the same coffee shop, and I wasn't proud of the thoughts rolling through my head, thoughts that toyed with my sanity, testing the limits of my own humanity. I could hear my heart pounding within the petrified silence, the air thick as if the rain outside had seeped into our souls. Every interaction matters, she hissed, leaning closer still, unyielding. I held my breath, feeling myself unravel, wishing for the comfort of ignorance, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she added, you think you understand what hell smells like, don't you? The way she said it settled into my mind, twisting something deep inside me that tasted like regret and fear. I suddenly feared she could see through my facade, peel back my parameters and expose all that lay in ruin beneath. I was just about to protest, to shove her back into the abyss she claimed to know so intimately when, without a moment's warning, her left hand moved with precision to her coat pocket. Instinctually, I shrank back, my heart racing, wondering what she could possibly produce from that tangle of fabric. But then a glint caught the light, and in the size of an instant, I realized it was a small brass key, the kind you might find in an old hotel room. You know, ever since I showed up, you have been hating this moment, she whispered fiercely. But I could set you free, you know? I keep the worst of them at bay, all you have to do is ask. My gaze darted around the coffee shop, searching desperately for a sign of absurdity, for anyone to back me, but their eyes had diverted, and I was left tethered to this strange, grim pact looming at the fringes of sanity. What are you talking about? I challenged, although I sounded more confused than defiant. She leaned closer still, and I felt the unmistakable sting of desperation and danger weaving through the air. I know people think I smell bad, but you don't understand. There are demons where you can't see, they cling to people who let them in. I've held them back. You don't have to live with that fear. I shook my head, shifting back in my chair, but she moved closer until her breath grazed my face. Let me show you. I couldn't shake the sensation sprinting up my spine, her hand twitched like it was beckoning me to reach out. Then it was as if the world around us fell away, like I was in a dark vessel with no exit, feeling hovering eyes that weighed heavy upon my back. The scent, the woman, everything converged into a living nightmare before it struck me how wretchedly hopeless I felt. Was it wrong to reject her? Was I complicit in her suffering? The air was thick with a bittersweet kind of tension, like looking in the mirror and not recognizing who stared back. And in that fleeting moment, I could hear whispers creeping down the edges of reality, muddying the waters of my sanity. You could run, she was saying, but wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know what you push away, what you so readily abandon in your comfortable life? Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to refuse, to go back to my latte and the momentary safety of shallow pleasantries, but I felt something else kindle inside me. I leaned slightly closer, just a breath as I murmured, "What do I need to do?" The laughter returned, twisted and sharp, but then her expression shifted, and she froze, eyes glimmering with sanity and chaos interspersed. Nothing, really. Just acknowledge what is around you. Just for one moment. And then in that celebrated whiplash, I gasped as she broke into a wide grin and suddenly the cafe fell silent. I twisted my head around like a puppet on strings to see what lay behind me, but there wasn't anything there, just the reflective glass that taunted my confusion. Your demons are real, but they take many shapes, she continued, voice low and mesmerizing, and in that inward feeling, the vibrations of anxiety raced up my throat. The key suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hand, like it was holding a world I couldn't comprehend. Acknowledge them, and you might find what really haunts you isn't me at all. And just like that, a shiver coursed up my spine, underlining the unsettling reality that perhaps I shouldn't have pushed her away, perhaps I would walk out of this coffee shop and carry her stench with me, her essence following, wrapped around my neck like a noose tightening with every breath. What turned from laughter shifted back to suspicion again, and the weight of the moment crashed down, but it was too late. I was scared, held captive by the disconcerting truth behind my own choices, and as the crowd connected with fleeting uncertainty, this woman, in her tattered raincoat, had opened the door to something buried deep within. Darkness doesn't require permission, it just waits in the shadows, waiting to devour you whole while you dismiss those looking for refuge, blurring the lines between safety and fear. I straightened, the coffee shop's familiarity almost gone, as her stormy eyes implored me to see beyond my aversion. And deep down, as the rain thrummed against the windows and people shifted in their chairs, I realized I might have made a choice in that moment, a choice that I would come to reckon with long after we parted ways. The coffee shop could never provide the safety I craved, only a fleeting mask over hidden truths. My heart raced in anticipation of what lay beyond, and I suddenly needed more than just my latte. I needed to discover the depths of those demons lurking just out of sight, ready to carve a path I wouldn't soon forget. When my mom told us she was marrying Gary, the first thought that crossed my mind was disbelief. It wasn't even a month since Dad had walked out, leaving us shattered and frail, and now she was inviting a stranger into our lives, a man whose mere presence made my skin crawl. Initially, I tried to be supportive, brushing aside my gut feelings as selfishness, so I told myself that maybe this was her way of coping, a distraction from our family's collapse. But as the weeks dragged on, it became agonizingly clear that Gary was not just a temporary figure in our lives, he was here to stay. He brought along with him a chilling entitlement, like the world belonged to him, and as he forced his way through our family, I felt more like a visitor in my own home, an intruder watching the landscape of my childhood warp under his influence. The first time he yelled at me for leaving my shoes in the hallway, I told him it was no big deal. I was tired of the fighting, the sorrow of our broken family, but something deep inside me snapped. It was the way he stood there, his hands on his hips, like he was ready to bulldoze through whatever shred of dignity I had left. That night, as he slept blissfully beside my mother, I imagined him waking to find his face painted with my dad's words, the ones that had left our family in tatters. I wanted to scream at her about the mistake she was making, how he would never fill the void Dad left behind, but every time I tried, the words choked me, turning my voice into whispers drowned in my fear of breaking her already fragile heart. Yet, there came a moment, just a fleeting moment, as she cooked dinner one night, hinting at another family trip, that the rage boiled over. With my fist clenched and my heart racing, I yelled, "You'll regret picking him over us." The silence that followed was palpable. I thought she might throw something or, at the very least, give me a stern talking to, but instead, she froze, her spatula midair, eyes wide and glazed with shock. I felt as if I had fired a bullet into my own heart, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small it broke me. "We need a new beginning, and I'm not asking for your approval." Those words hung heavily in the air, stinging like a slap when they settled around us. It was a bitter realization that my childhood was effectively over. In her eyes, I was just a child holding on to the past like a toddler with a ragged security blanket, while she wished for rebirth into this new life with Gary. What followed was a spiral, a slow, excruciating descent into a reality I hadn't signed up for. Gary installed webcams around the house, claiming it was for our safety, but it felt more like a prison, as if the walls had ears to report every tiny dissent I dared to voice. He would smirk when Mom wasn't looking, his gaze slicing through me like a knife. Every meal became a twisted game of familial chess, his oily laughter ringing in my ears as Mom cooked for him, entirely ignoring my existence. I spent nights lying awake in bed, replaying that moment, wishing I had said something else, anything else, to sway her away from him, but every offer of concern bounced off her like rain on a roof. Then one fateful night, as I lay there contemplating another day of uneasiness under Gary's rule, I heard a commotion coming from the living room. I crept out of bed, heart thumping, to find him yelling at Mom, who was crying as she tried to reason with him, her voice cracking. I wanted to rush in, to yell at him to leave her alone. Instead, I froze, paralyzed with fear. That was when she let it slip, slightly drunken, her guard down, that she didn't want us anymore. It was a bomb going off in my chest. I stumbled back into my room, tears burning my cheeks. It was like the ground had opened to swallow me whole. I thought about how far we could fall as a family, about how Gary would exploit this weakness, so when Gary struts into my room a few days later, waving a crumpled paper, I half expected him to tell me about a new rule. Instead, he smirked and said, "I'm adopting you, kiddo. It's about time you accepted this." That's when I snapped. I realized I had been a puppet, letting them walk all over my hurt, so I shouted back, "You're not my father." The ensuing silence felt oddly nostalgic, as if anyone could hear each shattered fragment of my resolve play out. That's when something deep and ancient within me awoke, a primitive response to defend against the encroaching darkness. I confronted my mom one last time, trembling but determined. I addressed the reality with her, recalling moment after moment of her dismissive disbelief. "You won't be happy with him," I said, every word laced with an urgency rooted in pure love for my family. "He doesn't care about you, he treats you like some pathetic plaything." I'll never forget the moment her eyes darkened, a storm brewing beneath the surface as she spat back, "You are too young to understand love." A flicker of regret crossed my mind when I bolted, stomping upstairs, but I held on, convincing myself this was my last act of defiance. The following week, I stood in front of my old friends at school, sharing my story, trying to piece together the shattered remains of my heart. They listened, some nodding, others swiping tears away, their empathy wrapping around me like a balm, healing the jagged edges that Gary and Mom had left behind. But just as I began finding strength in their kindness, I received a message from my mom, an ominous text saying she didn't want to speak with me again. I felt gutted but also invigorated, the urgency to protect my fading family now morphing into a will to break free. I started planning a life without the continued weight of a reality tethered to Gary, until one day, my phone buzzed with the dreaded news: Mom had taken off with Gary, leaving everything behind. Maybe she saw it coming, or maybe she was always willing to trade legitimate love for empty promises. And in that moment, as I stood in the remnants of a life long stifled, I realized, perhaps I was wrong to claim she would regret her choices. The devastation of my truth had always belonged to her, driving me forward as the weight of her choices shattered my once unbreakable spirit. As I sit here writing this, the heaviness of the loss smarting in my chest, I can't help but wonder, in a way, if she did regret it, for in gaining a husband, she lost her children, and that emptiness is louder than any curse cast upon her. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum as I stood at the edge of our yard, peering through the trees at the gathering across the street where my younger sister and her friends threw what they called a party. It wasn't the kind of party filled with balloons and cake, it was dark and chaotic, the flickering glow of a cheap disco light battling against the encroaching shadows of twilight. I had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed inside and studied while my sister, Mia, had been allowed to explore the edges of that reckless freedom. But as I listened to their laughter thick with smoke and heard the muffled beats of music that felt too loud for our suburban neighborhood, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. When I accidentally overheard snippets of their conversations just a few nights before, a part of me wanted to look away, pretend I didn't hear them boast about sneaking out, drinking, and trying drugs, things I never thought Mia would dare to touch. But every time I thought about ignoring it, I pictured the way our mother would break if something happened to Mia, and the moral weight that pressed down on me was suffocating. I had to make a choice. So, I did what I thought was right, and I slipped through the door, my palms clammy against the cold brass knob, and I told our mother everything. At first, she didn't believe me, perhaps she couldn't bear to think that our sweet Mia, her golden child, could stoop to such depths. I led her to the window, hoping this time she would listen, and with each step toward that gathering, I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing heavy with anticipation for both of us. The moment she turned pale and I saw her fist clench, I knew I'd made the right choice. But the reality we stepped into was nothing short of catastrophic. Mia's laughter vanished into the night as Mom stormed over to where they were dancing, and I wished I could feel as invincible as they seemed. When Mom confronted her friends, I watched the chaos unfold, their innocence bled away, replaced by guilt, as they scattered like skittles dropped on asphalt. Mia, shattered and furious, faced our mother the way a wild animal afraid for its life might confront a hunter. What followed was a symphony of screaming that rattled the very windows, a confrontation that carved itself into the fabric of our family. My sister was kicked out of the house that night, a decision permeated with shame playing across my mother's face like a veil. The last time I saw Mia, she stood at the door, eyes locked onto mine, and I dared not look away. Could I, the one who had always protected her, really be the monster who caused all this? Was I, in fact, an awful person for looking out for her? Guilt ate at me for days following the incident, but there was also a creeping sense of fear lingering in the corners of my mind. As the days melted into weeks, Mia's absence turned our home into a hollow shell. Our mother's grief manifested in silence, each meal a reminder of the laughter that once filled the air. I received mixed messages from everyone. Friends at school whispered their pity while my teachers offered me haunting looks that spoke volumes, as if they miraculously knew my hand in the fray. I thought about reaching out to Mia, but the shame rooted me in place, tightening every nerve and leaving me wondering if I had made a dreadful mistake. One night, when I couldn't bear the haunting guilt any longer, I decided to text Mia, an olive branch, a feeble apology hidden behind layers of regret. But instead of the expected "I miss you" or "I understand," she simply replied, "You have no idea what you've done." Those words slashed through my chest. I half expected a sob fest but instead got cold dread that coiled within me. For weeks, I left my phone on my bed, too frightened to reach out again, until one day when I received an unexpected voicemail. "You'll pay for this," she snarled, her voice dripping with malice, warped and unrecognizable. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking just behind my shoulders. I could hear the whisper of Mia's name on the wind whenever I walked to school, could sense the malicious energy in the air that followed me home. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, heart racing, convinced Mia had turned into something more sinister, a specter lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Then, the knocks started, quiet at first but building into furious strikes that made me jump. Each time I opened the door, my heart would leap, praying it was merely a neighbor or the pizza delivery guy, but always hoping to see her face, until one evening, it was my mother who answered the door, forcing a grin, sagging under the weight of her grief. That night, the silence deepened, a heavy blanket pressing over our home, and I could swear I heard Mia's laughter echoing off the walls in the dead of night. The weeks dragged on, my anxiety spiraled, until I could no longer tell when I was awake or dreaming. Then came the night of terror, an unspeakable thing that broke through the stillness of our home. It awakened me from a restless sleep, a piercing shriek echoing like steel scraping against stone. I bolted up, breath hitched in my throat, heart pounding as I grabbed my phone, praying it wasn't Mia, that she hadn't returned to exact her revenge. I opened the door a crack, shadows danced under the moonlight, and creeping dread slid into my bones. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar scent of smoke clawed at my throat, reminding me of those forgotten nights by the tree across the street. What I found at the end was nothing I could have ever imagined. Mia stood there, features twisted in rage, surrounded by her friends, an odd gathering that felt both foreign and familiar in a way I couldn't comprehend. Except now, they wore masks, faces twisted in grotesque expressions, and when they turned to me, the air filled with chilling laughter that echoed my wildest fears, inhuman, mocking. "You should have left us alone," Mia hissed, her voice slipping through the masks of her friends, haunting and venomous. I tried to back away, but a force pulled me forward, chaotic energy bubbling in the air, vibrating through my bones, my heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" I stammered, but the swirling laughter grew louder, drowning out my voice and whispering, "It's your fault, you wanted this." In that moment, I realized the truth planted firmly in the pit of my stomach. I didn't just lose my sister that night, I had lost myself as well. The love I thought could conquer all had twisted into something malevolent, and I was left in a game I never volunteered to play. As the laughter soared, crescendoing into a feral din that shattered the walls of my sanity, frantic thoughts raced through my mind. Were they all just figments of my imagination? But the unmistakable truth clamped around my throat like a vice. I had brought this darkness upon both our lives. I could hear them chanting, words that stole the warmth from my soul, and at that moment, I understood their true nature. They were no longer just me as friends, they were something darker, something that thrived in the shadows I had feared all along. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of regret and despair suffocating, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I realized not just who Mia had become, but also who I had become, a puppet on strings of guilt. As the laughter enveloped me, each teasing taunt whispered back memories of warmth, love, and laughter, replaced now by darkness, echoing indefinitely against the walls of our broken home. In that moment of clarity, I knew it was too late to save her, and too late to save myself. When I was 13, my family took me to visit my cousin Chloe, who lived in a small town where rumors wrapped around old houses like thick vines, and where the wind seemed to be a constant whisper of secrets. I adored Chloe, she was always the life of the party, brimming with laughter and confident chatter. But that summer night, everything changed when I ventured into the unfamiliar shadows of her house, seeking the solace of her bedroom, where old posters flaked on the walls and scented candles struggled against the oppressive humid air. Chloe's boyfriend, Tom, was there, and he wore an unsettling grin. "You should really see how easy it is to summon spirits," he said, a spark of something darker glittering in his eyes. I shrugged it off, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, but his words festered, like a nest of wasps in my gut. Later that night, after he shoved a chair beneath the window and claimed to have called the dead by their first names, we gathered around the small table, Tom urging us to play a game, an innocent enough guise, but I could tell he was feeding off my unease. Chloe twirled her hair, oblivious to the dread crawling up my spine, but despite my protests, curiosity clawed at me until I felt I had no choice but to give in. As we joined hands in a circle, Tom began talking to the darkness, inviting any entity to join us, while a chill seeped into the room. A pressure hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as the candles flickered wildly and the temperature dropped. I shuddered, desperately wishing for a way out, when a flash of cold wind swept through the eerily still air, and the lights flickered, sending all three of us sprawling in panic against the wall. I thought I saw it, a shadow darting behind Tom, and I swear, for a brief moment, I could feel the breath of something unfathomable on my neck. "Stop it," I shouted, the pitch of my voice breaking. Chloe shot me a hurt look as Tom smirked, clearly reveling in my unease. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like she was nothing more than a pawn to be manipulated in his sick game. When I finally pulled away, running down the dimly lit hallway with pounding footsteps, I felt something cold and unyielding grip my heart, like the hand of whatever he had conjured. I stumbled out of the house, frantically kicking stones in the gravel driveway, determined to put distance between me and Tom's sinister antics. As I walked away, I lost track of time, my senses overwhelmed by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant murmur of wind slipping between the trees. I thought, foolishly, that I could shake the feeling of dread, but in the pit of my stomach, I felt I had made a mistake. By leaving, I had done something wrong. But suddenly, a loud crash echoed behind me, and I turned to see the front door swing open, Chloe stumbling out, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you leave?" she wailed, her breath hitching. I could barely form a response, the morbid reality sinking in. Before I could say anything, she yelled, "You made him angry." Confusion overwhelmed me as she explained how Tom had followed me, his demeanor shifting from smug to furious in seconds. I wanted to retreat into my own thoughts but couldn't. Her anguish was palpable, igniting guilt for a decision I'd made. "You shouldn't have played that game," she cried, her body trembling. Moments later, Tom stepped out onto the porch, his expression morphing eerily from anger to something chillingly vacant. "This is all your fault," he said, voice eerily devoid of emotion, before he slammed the door shut. It felt surreal, like being trapped in a waking nightmare, where reality began to fray at the edges. The sound of the waves crashing in the distance melded with Chloe's sobs. I attempted to comfort her, but it didn't help. It felt like I was trying to stop a tidal wave with my bare hands. What happened next is a blur. A strange stillness settled in the air, wrapping around us as if the universe itself paused to hold its breath. Chloe's phone buzzed violently, and she snatched it up, eyes widening. "It's Tom," she whispered, trembling. The heavy air thickened as she pressed the phone to her ear. I stood frozen, the world blurring around me as I listened to her end of the conversation. "No. Please, Tom. Don't say that," she begged, her voice breaking. When she finally hung up, her face was drained of color, a ghostly pallor that terrified me. "He's done," she whispered hollowly, and for the first time, I felt fear gripping not only for her but for what lurked just beyond the threshold of normalcy. It turned out that every time I left a room, every time I faltered, it incited a violent reaction in Tom. The shadows had answered his desperation. He wasn't just losing Chloe, he was losing himself, and in that moment, it felt like a dark loop had eclipsed our lives. I felt as if I had stumbled into a living horror story, where the protagonist's decision to run away from danger only served to amplify the horror for those left behind. Days turned into months, and Chloe would later describe that night as the beginning of the end. She could still hear him speaking in tongues, lost in the dark magic of old stories he shouldn't have touched, and somehow I felt responsible. It wasn't a clear-cut evil, no one died that night, but in her eyes, I could see the shadow crawl deeper, and I knew I had done something irrevocable. My heart ached with the weight of knowing that every sob escaping her lips felt like a piece of the blame sinking into my chest. Each encounter felt haunted, and every family gathering turned sour. The laughter morphed into daggers each time I saw Tom in the corner, wearing an expression of abandonment. He unleashed chaos in a white-hot rage, and soon after, their relationship crumbled, but the repercussions reverberated through Chloe's life like thunder. Was I really an asshole for leaving, or was it merely a breath before the descent into madness? It's hard to differentiate what's tangible and what's not when you're marking the boundaries of your sanity. While we navigate the dim corridors of our past longing for the light, sometimes the door you think leads to the safety of the outside world becomes the very breach through which darkness floods in, and the shadows inside you will haunt you long after you think you've escaped. I still wonder whether the real spirits were the stories we buried, too terrified to admit that they lived not only in the shadows of the night but eternally within us. I used to think conflicts in marriage were easy to resolve. After all, how hard could it be to express your feelings about something that's bothering you? But that was before the Fruit Loops incident, the night everything changed between my husband Eric and me. It began innocently enough. I was exhausted after a long day at work, and as I shuffled into the kitchen, I spotted Eric happily indulging in a massive bowl of cereal, the artfully vibrant loop smothered in milk, his face illuminated by the glow of the fridge light. I greeted him with a smile, expecting just a quiet moment to connect after a hectic day, but the atmosphere soured when I saw he already had a second bowl prepared, as if realizing he'd need it to satiate some insatiable hunger I didn't even know he had. My initial amusement turned to annoyance as he spooned a heaping helping into his mouth, the sound of the cereal crunching echoing in the dimly lit kitchen, like a cruel remix of my own spiraling frustration. "Are you really going to eat that much?" I asked, trying to inject a hint of humor into my comment, but Eric shot me a glare that poured ice down my spine. "What? It's just cereal," he replied, voice tinged with defensiveness as if I'd accused him of committing heinous acts. It struck me that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting, so I shrugged it off and made myself a much smaller bowl, but the unease lingered like a ghost I couldn't shake. I sat across from him, and we could barely look at each other as the silence stretched, punctuated only by the clinking of spoons and slurping milk, hollow reminders of our widening disconnect. Trying to break the suffocating tension, I suggested we talk about our days, sharing a story about a coworker's mishap that had everyone in stitches, but Eric nodded in response, his focus unwavering from the bowl as if I were speaking an entirely different language. I could feel rage bubbling beneath my skin, a helplessness morphing into something primal, and I couldn't help but feel he was deliberately ignoring me. Finally, in a moment of clarity wrapped in a shroud of frustration, I blurted out, "It's kind of selfish to hog all the cereal, you know." Silence ensued. Eric's spoon clattered against the bowl, the sound sending a shockwave through my chest. "Selfish? You think eating a bowl of cereal makes me selfish?" He asked incredulously, his voice rising, anger twisting his features into something I almost didn't recognize. I was tired. Just because I want to enjoy my food doesn't mean I'm putting myself before you. The atmosphere became thick with unsaid words. I felt a reservoir of tears threaten to spill over, and I wasn't sure why I felt so shut out. My unease blossomed into outright confusion because it was just cereal, wasn't it? What did it even mean when we hurled accusations back and forth like cold cuts at a deli, the oddity of the situation spiraling toward an absurd conclusion? You're making a big deal out of nothing, Eric. Spat, indignant, and for a fleeting second, his ire glanced off my armor of hurt. Perhaps I was making a mountain out of a molehill. But then came a wave of bitterness that I couldn't ignore. Wasn't this about more than Fruit Loops? It was about our relationship, the chasm that had grown between us, countless nights of silence more poignant than words, several missed connections disguised as life's daily grind. I felt utterly alone in my desire to bridge that gap, a rhythmic pulse pounding in my ears as he continued to scoff at my words, chewing through each syllable as if they were the very cereal he deemed more important than our conversation. The bowl became a battleground as I accused him of being neglectful, focusing on superficial things instead of the underlying issues that screamed for attention. If I can't even talk to you about our basic needs, who am I to share my life with you? I felt raw, exposed, like a creature caught in the harsh light of his casual apathy, but he refused to budge, scoffing as he dug into another helping, the brightly colored pieces swimming in milk, blissfully unaware of the maelstrom of emotions swirling just a few inches away. I got up, slammed my bowl in the sink, and stomped toward our bedroom, where the weight of my words loomed over me. I slumped against the door, trying to catch my breath as I felt the tears tumble down my cheeks. Am I the entitled one here? The nagging voice inside me echoed as guilt washed over like a tidal wave. But rather than reflecting on my own pain, I wondered if he could truly remain indifferent while the world burned around him. This was more than cereal. It was the way he could eat so blithely while ignoring the hollow sounds of our lives barely touched by intimacy. Hours passed, my thoughts spiraled until they felt tangible, raw like a wound, and when I heard the soft patter of his footsteps creeping toward our bedroom, I thought maybe we could reconcile. But instead, Eric stood at the threshold, and before I could even summon a calm demeanor, he mumbled something unintelligible that sounded much like an apology but felt entirely hollow, just a way to end the night without earnestness. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, shame shimmering briefly only to collapse under the weight of his pride. I muttered something back, words soaked in resentment, and, in that moment, in that oh-so-ordinary kitchen illuminated with memories and the smell of fading milk, I realized this dinner was more than a bowl of cereal. It had come to symbolize everything gnawing at us beneath the surface, the inability to dig deeper, the hesitance to face what was truly wrong. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, allowing exhaustion to wash over me, yet sleep eluded as I replayed the events of the night like a reel in slow motion. In that ache of solitude, I understood something crucial. It wasn't about cereal anymore, it was about feeling unseen. The next morning was a chilly void of unspoken words. You could cut the tension with a knife as neither of us acknowledged what had transpired. Eric settled back into his routine, stepping lightly with precise purpose, brewing coffee while I poured cereal, determining to trudge forward despite the weight of resentment. Should I have bitten my tongue? Should I have just let him indulge? But beneath that question lurked a deeper one: was I wrong for wanting recognition? Days turned into weeks, and while practical matters continued as they always did, I felt the shift, how we danced around each other more carefully, like two actors performing in a play where the audience was unaware of the tension building offstage. I found solace in the quiet of night when I could replay our childish skirmish, flesh and blood memories tinged with bitterness, wondering if we were just prolonging the inevitable, forcing ourselves through to the end of a dull script. And then, one evening, as I flicked through Netflix in a desperate bid to create a new shared experience, I offered to make dinner. Maybe my gesture would be perceived as an olive branch. But after gathering ingredients and cooking a meal for two, I hesitantly beckoned Eric to our table, fiery lights dancing against the walls, and proposed we eat together instead of watching another episode without so much as a glance or a word exchanged. He looked up, reluctance flickering across his face as he joined me, but the table was a quiet battlefield once again, simmering words lingering in the corners of our postures. I couldn't hold back the flood anymore, all those hidden truths threatening to explode, the silence we'd sustained too long wrapped around our throats. You know, I called you selfish for a reason because you're not the only one hurting here, I said, heart racing, pouring out my frustration, and finally giving way to the aching loneliness I felt. His brow furrowed as if I had disturbed some old, long-buried pain. When he finally spoke, it was in a whisper laced with vulnerability. "I didn't mean to shut you out. I thought Fruit Loops would fill a void. I didn't realize I had created another." In that moment, I understood what we'd both been trying to stave off: the hurt, the apathy, the mounting discontent. But what terrified me more than the fight over a bowl of cereal was the recognition that maybe the things we felt compelled to fight over were only reflections of the storms brewing beneath the surface. And that night, instead of cereal becoming our destruction, it transformed into something unexpected, an offering of understanding, a chance to heal the wounds left festering in the shadows. We each took a slice of the truth, and through the darkness, the glow of hope started to dance in the periphery, a tiny flicker promising that even the smallest battles could become the beginning of something new. And as we sat there, spooning in unison, I realized sometimes it takes a bowl of cereal to really see each other again. Thanksgiving had always been a family affair in my house, but this year felt different. This year, my husband eagerly announced his friend might be bringing her dog to dinner. Her dog, a strange hybrid mix of some kind of terrier and things I couldn't even identify, had a penchant for mischief, and as someone who had witnessed the aftermath of its chaotic visits in the past, I immediately felt a chill creep down my spine. From the moment I said no to the canine inclusion, an unseen tension crackled through the air like static electricity. My husband's face darkened, and a silenced argument bubbled beneath the surface. "It's just a dog," he'd insisted, but I couldn't shake the memories of Thanksgivings past where that little beast had devoured half of my cousin's pie and shredded a pillow beyond recognition while the adults were too distracted by football to notice. Besides, there was something unsettlingly unnatural about how that dog would stare at me from the corner of the room, its dark eyes boring into my soul, as though it were waiting, watching, plotting. In the days leading up to the dinner, I was met with accusations of being a dog-phobe, and while I had nothing against dogs in general, there was something profoundly off about this one. When Thanksgiving Day finally arrived, I found myself setting the table with a sense of dread, the silence of my reluctance hanging thick in the air. As my husband and his friend arrived, I noticed she wore this bizarre, almost victorious grin, as if the anticipation of chaos fueled her swagger. "You didn't really think she would have to leave her dog behind, did you?" She chuckled, throwing me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. The door swung open, and Toby, a name the dog bizarrely longed for, pranced into the house, his small body wiggling eagerly. I felt a knot form in my stomach as it darted around, sniffing everything, as if cataloging my life's most precious belongings. Dinner progressed amid the usual laughter and chatter, but I couldn't focus. My unease festered like a wound. That dog, now settled like a predator on a distant rack of bones, would occasionally fix me with its unsettling gaze, and each time I caught it watching me, the atmosphere warped around us. I started hearing whispers in the shadows, hushed tones that sent an ice-cold tremor through my bones, as if conversations were happening just out of sight, echoing thoughts that were never spoken aloud. The friendly barking morphed into something darker as the hours rolled on, and laughter turned hollow, every cheerful exchange gouging deeper into my consciousness, replacing comfort with creeping dread. At one point, while serving turkey, I looked up only to see Toby at my feet, staring, his pupils dilated to a menacing sliver. In that very moment, the power flickered, plunging us into darkness before the lights stubbornly returned, and suddenly it wasn't just the dog watching me, it felt as if something else lurked beneath the surface, hidden yet glaring. My eyes skimmed across the room, grasping for a shred of normalcy, only to lock onto Toby, who now seemed frozen, his body tense, poised as if preparing for something unspeakable. I forced a laugh when my husband and his friend joined me, but everything felt warped, strange, unsettling, a distortion of reality wrapped in familial love. When the dessert arrived, I felt the vibration of panic crawl through my fingertips as I skimmed across the table. I had baked a pumpkin pie my grandmother used to make. Just as I placed the pie down, Toby darted forward like a sprinter at the starting gun, sending the beautiful piece of pie flying to the ground, shattered into an unrecognizable mess. Everyone gasped, laughter dissolving into disbelief as my husband yelled, "Toby, no!" My pulse quickened, and in that instant of chaos, I felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a silent signal that something was horribly wrong. The dog wasn't just clumsy, he was deliberate, and I desperately shouted, "Get that thing outside!" Something in my voice snapped through the tension, and as Toby was whisked away, I turned to see my husband's friend buckle in response. The joy she'd entered with had morphed into something closer to rage. "What's wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice suddenly low, laced with venom. The rest of the night was a blur of hurried movements and strained silences, the air humid with unspoken tension, until I finally noticed the flickering lights again, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. The whispers grew, now harsh and chaotic, mocking me, taunting me. I couldn't shake the feeling we were trapped in some cruel play, and that little dog, no, that creature, was pulling the strings. Just as I thought the worst was over, the front door swung open, and I caught sight of Toby again, alone, sitting eerily still on the porch, head cocked at an angle, as if he had a message to deliver. My blood ran cold, an instinctual fear curling within me, and the room fell silent as everyone turned. "Where's your friend?" I choked out, my voice trembling. Just then, the atmosphere shifted, a cloud of apprehension flooded over us, washing away any last ounce of warmth. I glanced at my husband, only to see his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "She's got to be joking, right? She didn't go out there, did she?" he gasped, his mind racing. Time seemed to slow down. I had unintentionally opened a door to something dark and unfathomable, and as panic mounted, I braced myself in silence, a haunting thought spiraling within my mind. What had come into our lives alongside Toby? I kept searching for my husband's friend, but it felt as if she had vanished into the ether, a specter hidden among shadows. My heart raced wildly, the whispers louder now, seemingly orchestrating my descent into dread. I gathered the courage to open the front door, and what I saw snuffed the last flickers of hope from my mind. There, on the porch, was Toby, but the dog wore a face unmistakably adorned with blood, brighter than the crimson hues of falling leaves. What happened next unraveled everything. The shadows conspired, my husband stepped out, and in that instant, the world twisted, the line between human and beast blurred. I stood frozen as a deafening howl pierced the night. The laughter of my family became grotesque, mocking me, pulling me deeper into the oblivion. AITA. My once warm Thanksgiving dinner dissolved into echoes of despair, leaving me to wonder if my simple refusal had unleashed something far darker that lay nestled in the shadows, forever altering our lives, forever horror-drenching my innocent hopes. I always thought the worst pain I could feel was when I found out my parents were getting divorced, but that feeling shifted like quicksand the night my little sister, Lily, came to me with tear-stained cheeks, her voice trembling as she confessed that she had gotten her first period. She was just 11, and the innocence of her childhood streaked through her eyes, now clouded with embarrassment and confusion. I had been bracing myself for a long time, what with the endless conversations overheard at school and the so-called talk my mother gave me 2 years prior, but nothing could prepare me for the look on Lily's face, that mixture of fear and a burgeoning understanding of the chaos that awaited her. I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to recall the advice I had read online, about being supportive, about nurturing that bond since we relied on each other like life buoys in an unforgiving sea, even more so now that our parents were consumed by their own turmoil and neglecting us, both lost in their separations. I pulled her into my arms, and as she sobbed quietly against me, I was instantly pulled into a pit where the emotions swirled like a dark tornado, and in that moment I knew I had to step up, to protect her from the harshness of reality. I grabbed a roll of toilet paper and a pad from the bathroom, mind racing, recalling our mom's half-hearted attempts to prepare Lily for this moment. I quickly returned to her, guiding her through the basics, but in doing so, I stumbled upon an unsettling reality hidden in the folds of my sister's innocence. She revealed, hesitantly, that the other girls in school mocked her for being late and starting her period, whispered cruel jokes about how unsophisticated she was while hinting at something I feared she'd overheard about girls turning into women. I assured her it was normal, that our bodies had a way of doing things at their own pace, but as I said it, guilt gnawed at my insides, eating away at my conscience. How could I comfort her when I knew that what lay ahead would likely be filled with heartache, loneliness, and fear? We sat there on the edge of her bed, the quiet of night wrapping around us like a cold blanket, and with every wave of her breath against my shoulder, I felt the enormity of her vulnerability resting heavily on me. I tasked myself with being her protector in a world that often felt far too dark and unforgiving. I promised her that she wouldn't have to go through this alone, that I would always be there. Little did I know, those words would lead us down a path none of us were prepared for. The next day, Lily seemed different, almost more mature, as if a weight had somehow settled into her. I didn't take long before I began to feel something changing within myself, too, like some awful mirroring effect was taking place. In my quest to become her shield, I found myself swallowed by her emotional storm, helplessly caught in the eye where everything around us felt disorienting. I began to notice things. She developed new friends, appeared distant, but the worst part was the way I sensed something festering beneath her surface, like an unfathomable darkness or perhaps that deep sorrow that lingered behind her eyes. I wanted to speak to her, to coax out the shadows that now seemed to dance around her, but every time I did, she would brush me off with an insistent wave of her hand. One night, fueled by concern, I crept into her room after our parents had gone to bed. She was still awake, buried under the glow of her cell phone, and I plopped down next to her. I didn't even need to ask when she shifted, revealing a chat filled with messages that were thrusting her further into a world I didn't understand, middle school dramas, hints of early romances, and then, hammering home the point, someone had sent her a picture that left me cold. It was explicit, shocking, and everything a part of me wanted to shield her from. I felt furious. No, it was rage boiling underneath. How could anyone do that to someone so young? Without thinking twice, I confronted her gently, asking who was sending these things, our conversation turning sharp and painful as I realized she hadn't grasped the true weight of what she was dealing with. In that moment, too many emotions washed over me, but most of all was a feeling of isolation. I couldn't figure out how to help her, how to explain the monsters that lurked in the shadows without utterly breaking her spirit. Days turned into weeks, marked by evenings spent tiptoeing around her feelings while leaving me in the dark as she continued to withdraw. The minute she slipped out of my sight, it felt like I watched her die a little more every day, unraveling from love and into something that, well, what? I started to piece things together, realizing she began skipping classes, never mentioning who she was with, and then one day, she didn't come home at all. My heart crashed and burned in swirls of chaos as I called her friends, her school, my hands trembling in utter panic. Each second she remained away felt like ice carving into my veins until finally, as dusk set in, she sauntered through the door, seemingly unfazed by the hours spent being lost. As I bolted to her side, I searched her downcast eyes for answers, feeling that primal instinct to protect her surge one last time. When I asked where she was, she bristled, snapped back like a taut string before slipping into silence. I grabbed her arm, desperation creeping under my skin, and that was when things took a twisted turn. I felt fire ignite within her gaze, a fierce rebellion that she was beginning to nurture, and in the split second I had touched her, something deep inside flickered. I didn't expect her to lash out, her entire being springing into life, demanding that I back off. In that moment, I knew I had gone too far, that I had unintentionally shoved her closer to the edge. I hadn't voiced the words that were screaming in my mind. I was afraid that forcing her to reveal herself would only make her run further into that abyss. A part of me didn't want her to feel like I was another adult trying to control her. I had hoped to be her ally, her refuge, but she stomped upstairs, slamming the door in my face, and my heart shattered. For the next few days, I treaded carefully around the house, tiptoeing as if walking on shards of glass, instinctively holding my breath each time I heard her room creak. Then, another vision of anger flashed unveiled. I could feel my heart thundering as I heard muffled laughter from her direction, friends gathering outside to tease, and I saw them, those girls I had never approved of before. Who were they? I wanted to know why they were allowed to drag her into their world when it seemed to drip with deceit. I was about to barge out there, to pull her back, but suddenly I stopped. I felt this cold wave of clarity, recognizing that if I did invade her space, my little sister may very well tumble into an abyss far darker than what I had imagined. Instead, I chose silence, wrestling with the demons of self-doubt feeling heavy on my shoulders. Days blurred into months like an out-of-focus movie reel, and soon, my worst fears became reality. I found myself sitting across from a counselor, poring over the underlying pains that now accompanied our family, the way it twisted into this labyrinth of hurt, questioning where I had failed in being a sibling, and somewhere along the lines, I realized I had handed her over to those shadows, letting those dark forces seep through like poison into her very core. The last few weeks since we had that fight left me shattered. Late-night phone calls from parents screaming over the phone made everything tragic, like a play for a performance nobody wanted to witness. I felt the sting each time I saw her retreat into the darkness, feeling helpless behind my own walls, and knowing I would likely remain in the background while she began to spiral down that path without me. What hurt most was the knowledge that, while I had desperately tried to be her savior, I had ultimately failed in one crucial aspect. I didn't truly understand that stepping up meant giving her the space to figure out her identity without my controlling shadow looming over. The question haunted me, echoing incessantly, was I truly right or utterly selfish in wanting to drag her back from that darkness? What I had to learn, and what I hoped she could too, was that the road toward each other may be laden with shadows, but if she were in the darkness, I would be waiting for her beacon light, hoping she wasn't too far from remembering how to shine. I didn't expect my life to twist into this nightmare the day my husband brought his daughter from his first marriage to live with us. She was only 10, and he thought that having her here would help mend the fractured relationship they had, but, honestly, I felt like a stranger in my own home. Sure, I cared about her, she was a kid, after all, but I wasn't ready to be a parental figure, especially not so soon after we got married, and I made that clear to him, only for him to dismiss my discomfort with comments about being a real family. The first week was a whirlwind of chaos. She arrived with a duffel bag full of clothes but left the rest of her emotional baggage in her soul, the kind nobody else sees until it starts to weigh heavy in the air between us. Her name was Lily, and her big, doe-like eyes always seemed to hold memories of something dark, something unspoken. I sometimes caught her staring out of the window, as if waiting for someone or something that would never come, even as she wore a forced smile. The problem wasn't just her sadness, it was the creeping sense of menace that seemed to follow her, like something from a horror movie. There were strange occurrences, like objects moving on their own, or the times we'd hear soft sobbing at night, which would just be her mumbling in her sleep, but it made me feel paranoid every time I had to check on her. What made things worse was the way my husband looked at her, the way his eyes softened. It made me feel as if I was slowly exiting the picture, replaced by a ghost of his past. One night, while I was supposed to be preparing dinner, I heard her whispering to what I thought was an empty room, and when I walked in, she paused, her fingers tracing the edge of a dusty old book that had mysteriously appeared on the floor. I asked her about it, but her answer made my skin crawl. She said, "It's from my friend," which chilled me to the bone. I brushed it off, but the sense of dread grew with each strange event. The pictures on the wall started to tilt during the night, and whispers would echo in the hallways, trapped in the silence like trapped souls. I found myself constantly wondering if I was losing it, yet every time my husband and I fought, she'd seem to smirk as if she was the one pulling the strings in our marital discord. It escalated when I was packing for a weekend trip, and I found my necklaces strewn across the floor, hung like strange trophies on a noose made of what I could only assume was her sick humor. That night, I had a nightmare, a vision of a shadowy figure lurking behind her, its fingers stretched toward me. I jolted awake to find Lily standing at the end of my bed, her face illuminated by the moon. She simply smiled at me, tilting her head like a dog who hears a distant sound, which sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I screamed, waking my husband, who dismissed my fears as a mom's unfortunate imagination running wild, even when I showed him the book she claimed was from her friend. He read it and laughed, calling it a children's story, but the illustrations alone filled my stomach with dread. It was all about a little girl who made a pact with something ominous, something that came to collect its debts in twisted forms. I kept my confrontations about Lily's behaviors and the odd happenings to myself. After all, I was the one deemed the villain, labeled the stepmother who wouldn't embrace this child. The final straw came when Lily began talking about her friend more frequently. "He's coming to visit," she'd say with a serene smile, her eyes gleaming like the reflection of the moon in water. I thought I could reason with my husband, but he was too enthralled by her presence, a father blinded by the chance to rewrite their sad history. Then one evening, while I was in the kitchen, I overheard a snippet of their conversation. "She doesn't like you," is all I could catch, and then my husband's laughter, the sound grating against my instincts. I felt invisible, like a specter lingering in an abandoned house, and everything culminated when I returned home one day to find the house eerily silent. My husband was gone, and so was Lily. Panic gripped my chest like a vice as my calls echoed in the empty halls, the air thickened with uncertainty. Suddenly, the front door swung open. It was my husband, disheveled but alive, and behind him, with a faint glow, was Lily, holding a crude, dark drawing that depicted me, lifeless, under ominous clouds. My heart sank as I noticed her smile was replaced with a sinister, knowing grin as she said, "I told you he'd come back for you." That night, I sat trembling in bed, too terrified to sleep, the drawing propped open in full view, wishing with all my heart that this nightmare was just a figment of my overactive imagination. The atmosphere swirled with tension and malice, and each time I turned over in bed, it felt like eyes were watching me, waiting to collect something that had been promised long before I came into the picture. When dawn broke, the reality of my situation struck me, and for the first time, I wondered if I was making a mistake by refusing to take responsibility for the child who seemed to pull our family apart, knowing all too well that ghosts aren't always literal, sometimes they are very, very real, and I had become the woman caught in the suffocating grip of a sinister pact, wondering if I, too, would be forgotten like the countless characters in the tales that had begun to seep into my mind, hoping desperately I wouldn't become a warning for someone else in the dark. When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo? She said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear, she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal, Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene? It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. I never thought I'd be that guy who gets grossed out by his girlfriend, but here I am, sitting in my dimly lit bedroom, heart racing and palms sweaty, wondering if I'm overreacting or if there's something genuinely disturbing about the situation. My girlfriend, Lisa, is the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laughter. She's bright, funny, and has this magnetic smile that drew me in the moment we met at that dive bar last summer. But lately, something else has been drawing my attention, and it's not as pleasant as her charm. It started small. She'd skip washing her hair for a day or two, saying she liked the natural oils or didn't want to ruin her waves, but after a few weeks, it became clear to me that this was more than just a beauty routine, it was an outright neglect. I hesitated, thinking maybe it was a phase or some personal statement she was making about embracing herself, but by week 3, I couldn't ignore the pungent odor that lingered in the air after she left the room. It was like the smell of damp earth mixed with something rancid, and I tried to brush it off as a trivial inconvenience. We'd hang out at my place, and out of desperation, I would spray air freshener when she wasn't looking, hoping she'd catch a whiff and feel compelled to wash up, but instead, she just kept piling on the dry shampoo, like it was some magical solution. One night, we were on the couch, cuddling while watching a movie, and I caught a whiff that made me gag, subtle but thick enough to linger, and I couldn't help but pull away. The look she gave me was one of confusion and hurt, as if I had slapped her across the face, and that was the moment I knew I had to say something. "Lisa, can we talk?" I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think you need to wash your hair more often." I braced myself for a fight, but instead of anger, she just laughed, that carefree laughter that had enchanted me so many times, now tinged with disbelief. "You're kidding, right? It's just hair. Who cares?" But I could see her self-assurance crack a little, the laughter not reaching her eyes. The days turned into weeks, each one more unbearable than the last. As we spent time together, her hair became a distressing presence. It was always stringy and looked like it was home to a family of grease rats. I felt disgusting just sitting next to her. Friends and family began to notice too, dropping pointed hints that couldn't go unaddressed. At dinner, my sister casually asked, "Are you okay, Lisa? You're not looking your best lately." I felt that crushing embarrassment swell in my chest, the ball of conflict growing larger every time I pulled Lisa close. One night after work, I walked into our apartment, fully ready to be hit by that noxious cloud she now carried like a perfume, but what greeted me was oddly still. The whole place felt off balance, eerily quiet, and I immediately feared the worst. I wandered through the dim light, finding her bedroom door slightly ajar. I nudged it open, revealing the bed a mess of clothes and crumbs, but no Lisa. A sickening knot formed in my stomach as I turned to check the bathroom. The moment I stepped inside, reality twisted in a sickening way. The mirror was fogged up, and her hairbrush sat abandoned on the countertop, but where was she? The thought struck me like a lightning bolt that maybe she'd finally cracked. I found myself pacing the room, mind spiraling with worries, until I noticed the open window, and then I remembered something. She had mentioned a friend down the street hosting an art exhibit that night, so I grabbed my coat and rushed out, panic driving my feet. Arriving at the gallery, the vibrant colors painted walls contrasted sharply with the raw anxiety gnawing at my insides. I scanned the crowd, searching for her face, but found only strangers chatting and sipping wine. A wave of unease crashed over me. Where could she have gone? Just as I was about to text her, something deep within me prompted me to check the restroom. I pushed through the throng of bodies moving like a tide toward the bar, and as I reached the flickering light of the restroom sign, my breath caught in my throat. I could hear muffled laughter from inside, and I paused, my heart pounding. Forcing the door open, I stepped inside, and there she was, standing in front of the sink, her hair splayed out like a tangled mess, a friend from work, Jennifer, beside her. They both stopped laughing when they saw me, and the moment of silence hung heavy in the air, thick with all the things left unsaid. I stood frozen, my mouth working but unable to form words. "What's wrong, babe?" Lisa said, tugging a strand of greasy hair behind her ear, the innocence in her voice cutting deeper than any knife. My thoughts raced as I looked back and forth between the two of them. There was something unsettling about the way they were giggling, the way Lisa couldn't seem to feel the weight of the revolting crust forming on her scalp. Then Jennifer leaned closer and whispered something that sent chills racing down my spine. "It's only hair, right? It's like art, the messier, the better." Just like that, panic morphed into a visceral horror, and I stumbled backward, suddenly understanding that this wasn't a phase, this wasn't just about hygiene, but something far more sinister I hadn't grasped. An hour passed, and I was sitting outside, shivering not from the chill of the night, but the creeping realization that I couldn't be with someone who had willingly chosen to let themselves go so profoundly. I could hear the muffled noise behind me, laughter ringing out, but it all felt distant, strange. What kind of life did I want? Was I disgusted because I actually thought she was disgusting, or was my disgust a reflection of my own expectations of normalcy? When I went home that night, I tried to shake it off, but all I could think was that I felt trapped in a relationship that had dove deep into the abyss, her carefree attitude now looming over me like a shadow, leaving me pondering how far I would have to go to escape this tangled mess of love and revulsion. I texted her, "We need to talk," and waited, the screen flashing with those 3 little dots, and when she finally replied, it felt like the exhale I'd been holding for too long. "Can we talk about your hair?" I typed, my fingers trembling, but the response came quickly, and all at once. I wondered if it was really worth it to try and salvage what was left of us. AITA for being disgusted that my girlfriend doesn't wash her hair for weeks. The loneliness devoured me, as I realized I was getting sucked into the whirlpool of our differences, fighting with a growing sense of dread that maybe, just maybe, I'd be forced to choose between love and a life governed by a cleanliness I once took for granted. I never thought refusing to babysit my niece would lead to such a haunting series of events, but here I am, fingers trembling over my keyboard, desperate to share what transpired. It all began with a simple family gathering, my heart warm from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, until my sister, Lily, confronted me. She didn't care for the way I brought my boyfriend, Jake, around. She said it was inappropriate, like a circus show crashing into a serene family picnic. I was blindsided, and feeling cornered, I snapped, telling her that I wouldn't stand for her judgmental attitude and her constant need to control who I bring into our family's space. She retaliated by demanding I babysit her kids that weekend, as if promising to take care of her children hinged on my compliance. I returned home in a rage, refusing to justify myself further. A cloud of tension hung over my mind, but I convinced myself it was just typical family drama and that things would blow over. However, that very night, I received a call from my brother-in-law, frantic and nearly incoherent. He said something had happened, that the kids weren't behaving, and Lily was off the deep end. Wordlessly, I felt the shadow of dread creep in. It turned out he was wrong. Lily had taken the kids to a local fair, and when she didn't come back, well, the phone calls began flooding in. Hours stretched into what felt like an eternity, my stomach knotting more tightly with each unanswered ring, until they found her car abandoned in the parking lot, the engine still warm, and the haunting echoes of laughter from the carnival turned into sirens and chaos. It was only after frantic searches that they found her 3 blocks away, screaming at the top of her lungs, but not for help. She was screaming at her kids, who stood there, petrified with wide eyes and trembling limbs. The problem? She claimed she had seen something dark and lurking, something that she insisted was trying to get them. It wasn't just a skit, it was real to her. The way she talked about it, like it was a relentless predator stalking the shadows, had everyone on edge. It landed her in a psychiatrist's office, the official diagnosis being acute stress reaction. She could no longer care for her kids without assistance, and that's when the guilt hit me like a freight train. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I should have just sucked it up and done my part while juggling my own feelings about Jake. Instead, I'd stood my ground like some stubborn rock while she spiraled into the unknown. It didn't help that the kids became more withdrawn. They wouldn't speak about the fair or even look me in the eye anymore. So, feeling responsible, I offered to step in on weekend babysitting duties to support her recovery, but the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with unfinished chords that resonated unanswered questions. I began to notice strange things happening during these sessions. The kids would stare at empty corners of the room, whispering things I couldn't hear. Their faces turned pale as if they saw memories of something wicked, and one evening, while I was trying to distract them with movies, I caught them doodling in their coloring books. One innocent scrawl read, "It saw us." I brushed it aside, chalking it up to vivid imaginations, but then I heard soft thumps coming from upstairs when nothing was up there. My heart raced. I pushed through the fear, convincing myself it was old house creaks. But when the children's laughter turned to sobs, and they refused to go near the window, I decided I needed to confront this terrifying new reality. There was a lingering chill each night, and as I'd watch the kids fall asleep, I'd scour every inch of the house trying to find traces of what had stolen their joy. Then one night, while flipping through channels with the twins snuggled under blankets, a local news report caught my attention, a witness account claiming in the area, and I swear to you, it was the exact description of what my sister had said she saw. Something with long fingers and a grotesque face that would make shadows tremble. Feeling sickened, I dismissed it as coincidence but couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me. I called Lily, her voice muffled and terrified, begging me not to let the kids go outside alone, and suddenly, everything spiraled out of my control. I thought I was doing good by stepping in, but it only worsened. The kids' nightmares turned real, and they refused to stay in their rooms, screaming about the thing in the shadows whenever night fell. I tried to reassure them, but all they could talk about was how it knew where they were and how it wanted to take them. Every night, I'd hear the soft whispering and see shadows darting past the corners of my vision. I was sleepless, frantic, and terrified. Months went by and therapy didn't help Lily, and when I finally stole a moment to lay out everything that happened to my boyfriend, Jake, he listened, shaken but resolute, telling me we'd investigate the house. The moment we walked into that living room, I caught Jake watching the children out of the corner of his eye, murmuring, "It's just an illusion." I had hoped he was right. I couldn't bear the thought of the monstrous beliefs consuming my family. So one evening, armed with only a flashlight, we ventured through the attic, but all we found were old boxes and dusty memories until an unearthly silence hung in the air. I flipped the switch, and together, we felt the temperature drop, hardly a breath could be heard, and suddenly those whispers kicked in more clearly. In sharp clarity, I felt it wash over me, an overwhelming sense of dread cementing my feet to the floor, and Jake jerked back, his face paling as he swept the beam across the shadows. And there it was, lurking in the edges, a twisted shape standing tall, fingers stretching impossibly long towards us. I wanted to scream. My instincts yelled to run, to grab the kids and flee, but in that moment, terror froze us in time. The thing whispered a name, my sister's name, and I realized then that it had wanted her all along, wanting to drag her into its world of darkness. That's when I heard my niece's voice, soft, innocent, and oh so familiar, calling me from downstairs, begging me to come play. I snapped awake from my horror, clutching my boyfriend's arm, and somehow rushed down the stairs, screaming for the kids to get away from the windows, but the room was empty. Silence smothered me alive, and when we managed to tear ourselves outside, a suffocating realization washed over me: the children were gone. Lily, lost in her own hell, and my family fracturing from the inside out, while the shadows grew ever longer. So now I sit here, sleepless, haunted, wrapped in both guilt and unanswered questions, because the thing that took my niece, that thing that chased echoes across our lives, had started as a mere judgment at a party, spiraling into a nightmare I never wanted to be a part of. AITA for refusing to babysit when I had no clue it would unravel into a much darker unfolding? I never imagined I'd be embroiled in a battle of morality with my sister, especially not after a long day that started with the usual chaos of life with my own kids. But my phone rang in the middle of a meeting, and it was like my heart stopped when I saw her name. Sarah never calls unless it's an emergency. You need to come to the school now, she snapped, and it felt like ice water poured into my veins. What's happening? I asked, dread crawling under my skin like a swarm of ants. It's Liam. He's waiting for me, and I forgot to pick him up. In that moment, the world around me blurred, my mind replayed the image of my sweet, innocent nephew, all big brown eyes, and that shy smile, waiting all alone in a cold, unwelcoming cafeteria long after the bell had rung. I felt a surge of rage and disbelief. How could she leave him there? You put your phone on Do Not Disturb? Are you kidding me? I yelled, my voice rising in disbelief. She dismissed my concern with a wave of her hand, as if this was just a minor inconvenience. It's just a kid. He'll be fine until I get there, she responded too casually, shrugging her shoulder as if it was no big deal that her first grader was more vulnerable than a single light bulb flickering in a pitch-black room. I was enraged, imagining that little boy, staring at those doors, waiting for the only adult who he thought would pick him up, and instead, feeling the creeping realization that he'd been forgotten. My voice echoed through the phone, louder and sharper than I intended. You need to stop acting like this is acceptable behavior. What kind of person just leaves their child behind? What are you thinking? And as soon as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine as if something sinister was watching from the shadows. I drove to the school, every nerve ending in my body aflame with anxiety, imagining all the worst-case scenarios, the cruelty of older kids, the indifference of teachers, and the emptiness of that cafeteria. When I arrived, I burst through the doors. My sister was already there, but it wasn't her face I was looking for, it was my nephew. My heart raced as I scanned the space, and then I spotted him at a corner table, head resting on crossed arms, a pathetic, lonely figure surrounded by the echoes of laughter from children who had long since reunited with their parents. Liam. I called out, my breath hitching as he looked up, his tear-stained cheeks sending a dagger through my heart. He sprinted to me, wrapping his little arms around my waist as if I were the last lifeline in a drowning sea, and I couldn't hold back my own tears. Why didn't Mommy come? He whispered, his voice thick with confusion. I couldn't answer, as rage bubbled up anew along with maternal instinct. I turned to Sarah, my voice low but fierce. How could you do this to him? But the confrontation was interrupted by the school principal, a stern gaze beneath her thick glasses. I really need to speak with you both, she said, and her tone suggested this was more than just a simple late pickup. We were ushered to her office where she would reveal a deep concern for Liam's well-being, her voice grave. We've had reports of disturbing incidents in the area lately, she said, and my blood turned to ice. Children have gone missing after school hours. My heart dropped as the implications sank in, visions of what could have happened to Liam racing through my mind like a runaway train. I looked at Sarah, her face pale as she glanced at Liam, who now stood wide-eyed, oblivious to the danger that could have befallen him. I didn't know. She finally gasped, the reality of her negligence crashing down with the weight of 1,000 boulders. Everything changed in that moment. I could see her fear reflected in Liam's face, and it was then that I understood. She wasn't just careless, she was lost in a world of her own, one that wouldn't allow her to hear the tiny voice of her son, or the muffled cries for help of countless others trapped in their phones or their own minds. The principal continued, children need their parents more than ever, especially during these times. As she explained more about the cases in the area, I felt the air grow thick around us, suffocating. I had imagined a confrontation filled with shouting and blame, but instead, we were faced with the reality that we weren't just failing ourselves but the very ones we sought to protect. My anger morphed into deep sadness, the kind that grips you and doesn't let go, leaving room only for fear. My accusations hung in the air heavy, yet silent, while all I could hear was Liam's soft breaths and the distant voices of children still laughing outside, oblivious to the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. What haunted me then was the realization that perhaps, long before this incident, Sarah didn't just need me to yell. She needed me there, to guide her and Liam from whatever darkness she had fallen into, and that made me angrier than the reckless act itself. The principal's voice faded into a blur, warnings turning into echoes, while I held Liam close, swaying gently in a world now filled with shadows, not knowing if we'd ever truly be free of the hidden fears that lurk behind our screens, threatening to dissolve the fabric of our most sacred connections. How much longer could it go on like this? I never thought a simple trip to the store would turn my life upside down, but here I am, staring at a deliberately cracked rearview mirror and my shaking hands as I replay that day like a broken record. It was a Thursday afternoon when I made my way to the local grocery store, the kind where you can already smell the fresh bread wafting through the air the moment you step inside. I parked my car, a rickety old hatchback that sometimes felt more like a death trap than a mode of transport, and grabbed my reusable bags, satisfied at the thought of stocking up on supplies for the week ahead. As soon as I stepped out into the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off. I was just being paranoid. As I navigated through the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I felt an odd sense of unease gathering in the pit of my stomach, like a storm gathering clouds, but the distraction of choosing ripe avocados kept me focused. Then, just as I was about to pay, the store manager, a burly man with a thick mustache, confronted me. He pointed an accusatory finger and demanded to know why I had parked in the customer parking lot despite being a non-customer. My heart sank as I stammered out an explanation, grappling for words to deny the absurd claim. The truth was, I had shopped there plenty before. I was a loyal customer even if I wore the same ratty hoodie every time. But he wasn't having it, and soon enough, a crowd gathered around us like vultures drawn to a dying animal, some taking pictures on their phones, others whispering behind their hands. I felt my face burn as outrage and embarrassment battled inside me. I tried to plead my case, but the manager's eyes were void of sympathy, and he kept saying I had stolen a space meant for paying customers, almost reveling in my unease. The chatter swirled around me, and through it all, I became acutely aware of the other customers' judgmental stares, their silent alliances forming against me. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around to see a stranger who claimed to have witnessed everything. The wrinkle-faced woman looked deep into my eyes and said she had seen me walk into the store without a cart, evidence of my guilt, she implied. Before I knew it, I was in a full-blown confrontation, surrounded by angry voices as the scene devolved, and I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where all I wanted was to grab my groceries and leave. I thought I would cry, the humiliation of it all, so I decided to cut my losses and walk away. But before I made it to the door, I heard a loud shout that made me spin. "You think this is okay? You think you can do whatever you want?" It was a younger guy. He must have been no older than 25, and he was practically shaking with rage. My instinct told me to just leave, yet I felt a compulsion to respond. "I can park anywhere that's not specifically marked," I said, my voice tinged with desperation. "I'm a customer." Somehow, the words fell flat, and within minutes, I felt like I was the villain in a crime thriller. People were snapping photos, and I couldn't help but feel like I was reshaping their perception of me into something monstrous and self-serving. Heavy with the risk of escalation, I bolted toward my car, but the crowd followed me, whispers morphing into accusations, and I could hear the word entitlement thrown around like a weapon. My shaking fingers struggled with the keys, the metal digging into my palm like the weight of the judgments surrounding me. In that moment, a primal panic kicked in, and I took off, barely managing to slam the door behind me before revving the engine. I glanced in my rearview mirror. The crowd dwindled, but still, those eyes followed me as I sped away, fueled by something more than just righteous indignation. I thought about what they believed of me, a thief in plain view, a villain unseen until I was thrust into the light. I had an incessant feeling of being stalked as I drove home, every car a possible threat, every intersection a heightened crossroads of shame. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the weight of my crime settled heavily on my shoulders, pulling my spirit down. I locked the door behind me, determined never to revisit that store again, but the fallout was far from over. Over the next few days, I watched anxiously as the topic spiraled on social media. Someone had posted a video of the confrontation, painting me as a monster in need of public scorn. The comments were merciless, people calling for my head because of a miscommunication blown out of proportion. I struggled to sleep. Images of that mob haunted me as I tossed and turned, each creak of the house sending jolting terror coursing through me. I tried to remain disconnected, but it was impossible to ignore the shame, the anger, and the community I thought I belonged to suddenly turning their backs on me. I stopped going out, avoiding the grocery store like it was a plague zone, but I still heard whispers as I passed others in my neighborhood. Then came the calls. I got them all right, late at night just as I was starting to succumb to the silence of my home. They were taunting, anonymous voices echoing the very accusations that had attacked me days prior. I blocked number after number, but they kept coming, like a relentless tide, washing over me, burying me in guilt for something I had believed was just a simple parking dispute. I no longer found joy in cooking for myself or curling up with a good book. All I felt in the pit of my stomach was an ever-gnawing shame that clung to me like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. I began to question my own sanity. Had I really parked illegally? Did my neighbor slip the manager my license plate? The whispers grew louder, and they felt like the predator closing in on its prey. Then one night it all came to a head. I found myself pacing the floor, drowning out the voices in my head. I had to know the truth. The next day, I ventured out once more, heart pounding like a drum but determined to confront my fears head-on. I needed to know if it was true or just a horrible delusion created by my escalating paranoia. I parked in a remote corner of the lot, hidden behind a line of bushes, and I watched as the store, the employees, the manager, the customers, all of them went about their business, seemingly unaware of the nightmare that they had thrust upon me. It was then that I saw her, the woman from that day, her eyes scanning the parking lot, locking once again on a car that was far from mine. I noticed something was off, a slight look of satisfaction overtaking her usually neutral expression as she walked toward the store. She turned and looked right in my direction, but I was smart enough to stay hidden. In that haunting moment, I understood, this was never about a parking lot. It was about a power struggle, a humiliation that they sought to inflict on someone who didn't fit their ideal of a perfect customer. I got back into my car and drove away, heart racing, but deep down I felt empowered. I finally had clarity of a sort. Perhaps I could never return to a place I loved, but now I knew, I was never going to be their scapegoat again. In lieu of acceptance, I chose to carve out my own reality, for whatever it was worth. As for the accusations, AITA. Well, maybe parking in that lot was the least of my sins, but now I'm focusing on how to rise from the ashes of a grocery store confrontation that left me feeling more human than ever.